Chapter 574. Lionel and Aina soared through the skies. Though it would have been faster if the surfboard entered its shuttle mode, Lionel decided against it. For one, the cockpit was too small for two people and he didn't feel alright leaving Aina alone at this moment. And, secondly, even though they might be able to squeeze in with how small Aina was, he wasn't confident in driving that monstrosity with just a single arm. With its speed, even a half-degree of deviation would fling them off course by tens of miles. So, Lionel sat cross-legged on the surfboard, gliding through the air with Aina balled up in his lap. Even now, she hadn't said a single word. Lionel gripped an herb ore in his good remaining hand, greedily absorbing its essence. The good news about his metal body was that he could heal himself even more effectively now just by absorbing the essence of metals. Since the foundation of his body had been built upon herb ore according to his father's instructions, for now, only herb essence had this healing effect on him. But now that he could branch out, whatever metals he used to build himself up from now on would expand his repertoire of healing ores. It had to be remembered that the most powerful ability of metal body wasn't in the astounding defense it provided to the user, but rather in the boost to affinity. Members of the Morales clan were able to absorb various ores and fuse them with their very being. Essentially, if Lionel really wanted a wind affinity, he only needed to absorb enough wind elemental ores. Usually, humans could only accomplish this feat with a very select number of extraordinarily rare ores, but Lionel and those with his lineage factor didn't have this restriction. In fact, as mentioned previously, Dimensional Cleanse spoke of one such vein type or to use in strengthening nodes and nodal passageways. But Lionel could take his own path in this regard. In fact, his current nodal system was far beyond the strength of what was theoretically mentioned in Dimensional Cleanse. Of course, there were still weaknesses to this ability. For example, if Lionel only absorbed fourth-dimensional wind elemental ores, his abilities would be capped at that level. In addition, he couldn't just skip levels and absorb a ninth-dimensional ore unless he wanted to die an early death. If he wanted to build an affinity, he had to slowly and steadily absorb essence of increasing rarity and strength. This, however, was where the Morales clan divine armor ability came into play. Unlike with metal body where one had to steadily build a foundation, the divine armor didn't need such forward thought. Lionel could build an armor of darkness now and just as easily build one of light at another time. The only restriction was in his bodily strength. It was these two abilities in tandem that made the Morales clan so powerful. Lionel had already settled on his first divine armor. It would be centered around his spatial type domain Oregon. As for the forward progress of his metal body, Lionel had no intention of doing something as silly as building a new affinity for himself. According to his father, the best use of metal body wasn't in creating new affinities, but rather in leaning into the ones you already had. Lionel suddenly coughed lightly, wisps of black smoke coming out from his lips again. Aina's eyes reddened at this sight, her lips moving with a sound beneath her mask. Eventually, she finally squeezed out a word. Idiot. Lionel was stunned for a moment before he began to laugh uproariously. Unfortunately, that laughter soon followed with coughing so harsh it seemed like he might cough out a lung at any moment. A very cool idiot though, right? Lionel grinned, his usually white teeth covered in soot. Considering that such blackness could only come from his charred inner organs, the sight alone was enough to send a shiver down anyone's spine. A little. Aina finally whispered. Lionel smiled so hard it seemed his skin might splinter. Still, don't do it again. I can't even show off a little bit without getting reprimanded. Is this what that old man called married life? Aina blushed profusely, but it was all hidden beneath her mask before rolling her eyes. Where's my husband, exactly? I can't seem to find him anywhere. Ack. My heart. Lionel grabbed at his chest. This blow, it was far more fatal than anything the puppet master landed. Aina giggled. At some unknown time, her mask slipped off and she planted a kiss on Lionel's cheek. Seeing it come off, one could finally lay eyes on her face. Though they had long since dried, one could still see the salty streaks her tears had left behind. She hadn't said a word during Lionel's battle, but that didn't mean it hadn't felt like every blow that landed on him had instead landed on herself. As much as she wanted to, she couldn't move. All she could do was watch. Maybe that was the puppet master's way of playing a sick joke. Even in those final moments, he never released his control over her. Lionel's pain faded into another smile. But, when he wanted to dive in for more, Aina dodged, causing his attempts to also land on her cheek. "We're in public. Have some propriety," Aina reprimanded. Lionel coughed on his own breath, looking down at the expanse of empty land beneath them. When had his Aina become so cruel? Aina's laughter filled his ears. She snuggled into his arms, a content smile on her face. However, before she could get comfortable, she realized that there were some uncomfortable bumps on what should have been Lionel's bare chest. She looked, only to find that odd breastplate still there. "What is this?" She couldn't help but ask. "Oh, this?" Lionel snapped out of his second bout of hurt. "This is the skeleton for my divine armor. It's actually pretty fragile. I probably should have put it away, but it was so comfortable I almost forgot it was there." Aina raised an eyebrow. "What about that looked comfortable?" Lionel smiled meaningfully. If it wasn't for this armor, he would have never locked space like that using the pull and repulsion of 2 teleportation arrays. If he didn't have it, he would have been just as helpless to move. That was just one of the weaknesses of his plan. The second weakness was the 5 minutes it took to implement. If White City didn't appear in the perfect location, the spatial lock would have never come into effect. The calculations were so complex that even for Lionel, they took 5 minutes to accomplish, and he had to experience Hargrove City personally. Well, technically it took closer to 7 minutes, but he had fought those giants first. "I'll show you the finished product in a few weeks," Lionel said, his eyes lighting up with anticipation. Just as Aina wanted to respond, her head snapped toward the distance. Lionel's gaze narrowed, the sound of battle drifting to his ears. Chapter 575. Fuck. Young Miss Swan, how can your Swan City be this useless? You've made no progress at all? Reynard appeared on the battlefield, cackling. He didn't have a flying treasure like Lionel, nor did he have any ability to do so on his own, so he could only stand atop one of the province's many collapsed buildings, using laughter to push away the very fear he had been feeling for so long. He had no idea about the changes to Earth's people, and his only knowledge of them was in battling them in a weakened state. So, seeing the mighty Swan City struggle so greatly against a single fort that wasn't even comparable to half the capital gave him a great sense of amusement. Of course, a portion of his hearty laughter was reserved due to the fact young Miss Swan had rejected his advances many years ago. So, seeing her struggle despite the fact the Swan family was supposedly so powerful left him in a good mood. Knowing Reynard, though, it was obvious things weren't so simple. A union of a city and a power would never happen. So really, he had only wanted to have some immoral fun with young Miss Swan. And, as the young heiress of such a city, how could she allow her purity to be tainted in such a way? Reynard may have twisted the matter in his mind, painting her as a stuck-up bitch. But the reality was very far from this. Still, Reynard wasn't exactly the picture of gentlemanly ideals. Was it really so surprising he had such thoughts? Swan City had always been a rival to Kiefer City. Although their current city lord wasn't a match for the dead Anared's father, Syl and young Miss Swan were always at a head. In fact, Lionel had witnessed this personally. With such strength, it was no wonder Swan City was tasked with handling Earth's third-ranked province, Royal Blue. Unfortunately, what was previously an easy battle had suddenly become difficult to even keep a foothold in. In fact, it didn't seem like it would be long until Swan City was being sieged rather than the other way around. Young Miss Swan's attention had been focused on her father, who was battling valiantly below, wearing his signature white armor. But, hearing Reynard's voice, many on the battlefield couldn't help but look in his direction. The young heiress frowned. When did the powers get to Earth? Down on the battlefield, Milan, Joel and Raj stood valiantly. Having been given positions as generals by the Secretary Marquisette, they filled their roles in better than anyone would have thought. Of course, if they were asked why, their simple answer would be that whenever they were stuck, they'd only have a single thought. What would Cap do? This simple-minded approach had actually placed them among the most effective generals of Royal Blue Fort. That said, their success was also in large part due to the cooperation of the nobles. After Code Black was implemented, they no longer dared to hold back lest the titles their families had fought to keep hold of for centuries suddenly vanish under their leads. Who's this dumbass? Raja's booming voice suddenly caused his troops to erupt in laughter. Their morale was already extremely high at the moment to begin with. Hearing such jeering right now made them feel as though they were on top of the world. Reynard was too far away to hear these words since Raj hadn't enhanced his voice with force. So, the latter kept boisterously laughing in his own world. After a moment, he calmed, sneering as he looked down on the battlefield. "I'll give you all one chance. Hand over all those with affiliations to Lionel Morales and I'll consider letting the rest of you live." Reynard's gaze lit with murderous intent. He had been humiliated more today than he ever had been before. He needed something to vent, and this Lionel would have to take the brunt of his rage. At that moment, numerous figures on the battlefield suddenly halted, their fiery gazes all landing on Reynard at once. In that instant, Reynard felt as though he had been plunged into a vat of ice. Several hundred meters separated him and the battlefield, yet it was as though a blade was being held at his throat. Reynard froze. By the time he recovered and shook his head, his fury had lit once again. Who the hell were these bastards to make him feel fear? Reynard suddenly growled, force surging around him in tidal waves. "It seems the Swan family is so incompetent that they've allowed you to grow arrogant. I'll kill you all the same way I killed that Black Lion and the other bastards of the Slayer Legion." "You killed who?" It was then the battlefield came to a grinding halt. Compared to when Reynard spoke Lionel's name, this was like a completely different animal. Let alone the soldiers of Royal Blue Fort, even those of Swan City felt like all the oxygen had been sucked away. In the skies, a surfboard with two individuals sitting upon it appeared seemingly out of thin air. They hovered above Reynard, the coldness that suddenly pervaded the battlefield emitting from them. If before Reynard froze, this time he couldn't even stop his body from trembling. His knees grew weak, almost collapsing completely. He had felt this feeling before. That day when Jianghu battled Aina, he had sensed it then too. Back then, he didn't even dare to breathe. But now, Jianghu had long since died at the hands of that dark-skinned, blue-eyed bastard. There was no one but himself to take the brunt of this assault now. Reynard's mind roared once again. This was the third time, it was already the third time he had been humiliated today. He looked up and his gaze landed on a face he wanted to rip apart. His fear gave way to a sneer. But it seemed that even he didn't realize his knees were still trembling. But, he had completely lost his rationality to his pride. "That's right, I killed them. That whore Pisces was a nice help as I dug out their hearts. There was even some bitch among them who was mumbling your name even as she died. I bet you cared quite a bit for her, huh? What are you going to do about it?" In Reynard's mind, these words had come out forceful and powerful. But, all everyone on the battlefield heard was a long drawn-out sentence laced with trembling stuttering. Even when he yelled with the last of his energy near the end, it was in a voice 3 octaves too high to have possibly come from a man. Chapter 576. Lionel couldn't put his fury into words. Even seeing Reynard's pathetic display did nothing to make him feel better. Just months ago, he had been with these young men and women, fighting to keep their lives, growing friendships, talking about life. Yet, no amount of anger would bring them back. Nothing he did to Reynard would appease him. Lionel was so agitated that he began to cough violently, the injuries that had yet to heal from his battle with the puppet master flaring up. Soot and char-covered air surged out from his mouth. His coughing became so violent that blood began to appear once again, sending his body into complete disarray. "Lionel." Aina worriedly placed a palm against Lionel's chest, her expression warping. The headpiece that had been in possession of the puppet master was burnt to ash by Lionel. He knew well that Aina wouldn't want to have anything to do with a treasure tainted by that thing, nor did Lionel need it. It might have been a quasi-bronze treasure, but it simply had no ability to boost the strength of Lionel's mind, which already had a fifth-dimensional foundation. Though it seemed as though the puppet master's mental strength was beyond Lionel's due to the range of its ability, this was a misconception. Lionel was well aware that the puppet master used a few tricks to accomplish such a feat, plus, the current Lionel could create such treasures on a whim as long as he had the ores necessary. This aside, Aina's birthday present more than covered for her weaknesses. It allowed her to see the true state of Lionel's body, and the reality made her expression warp. To say that Lionel was injured was an understatement. And, maybe the worst part about it all was that most of it was self-inflicted. Lionel purposely made use of his Scarlet Star Force in those final moments. Without it, it would have been impossible to burn such a powerful existence to ash. Unfortunately, even in such a measured and controlled fashion, the use had practically turned Lionel's insides into a charred mess. Not a single one of his inner organs were spared. If it wasn't for the insane amount of vitality the complete metal body provided, along with the fact Lionel's body had entered the fourth dimension, he probably would have formed a second pile of cremated remains beside the puppet master. Lionel's body had already been in a terrible state, but he had practically pushed himself over the edge. The overbearing nature of Scarlet Star Force wasn't just a legend. Seeing Lionel's state, many began to realize something was wrong, especially with how his murderous aura seemed to have deflated. Having regained much of the control of his body, Reynard suddenly realized that his previous actions weren't as valiant as he had thought. His temper flared once more, but this time he wasn't foolish enough to voice it again. He had already embarrassed himself enough today. Now, he just wanted to vent. Lionel looked up from his coughing, his eyes completely red. He somehow felt that he should have been there, but it was simply impossible for him to be everywhere at once. He didn't even know the Slayer Legion was taking part in this battle. It was an irrational guilt that weighed even heavier on his consciousness than before. This wasn't the first time Lionel had felt survivor's guilt, but this time still hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. Lionel's red eyes locked onto Reynard as though projecting the gaze of a wounded beast. It made one feel that no matter how injured he was, he would still find a way to take Reynard down with him, even if it meant having to rip the latter's throat out with his teeth. The murderous aura came back like an endless tide. This time, it was tens of times stronger, Lionel's irises reddening entirely. Flickers of flames licked across his body as though prepared to erupt at any moment. "I'll kill you." The words dripped with venom, frying the nerves and fraying one's senses. However, before Lionel could move, Aina gripped his wrist hard. "Stay," she said sternly, meeting Lionel's reddened gaze as though she couldn't sense his murderous intent. Even at this moment, she seemed to be the only one completely unaffected. Aina leapt from the surfboard, her hand reaching out into empty space only for a golden red axe to shoot into her palms. Reynard felt as though he was swimming in a quagmire, hardly able to budge an inch. But, seeing that it was Aina who actually dared to attack him like this, he roared, trying to expand his chest until his fear dissipated. However, the Aina he knew before was completely unlike the one now. Before Reynard could react, Aina had descended onto the building, her axe slashing downward. An arm flung into the skies, followed by a shrill cry. However, that wasn't the end of it. The mere blade wind of Aina's axe traveled through the building beneath their feet, splitting it in two. Reynard fell to his knees, grasping at his empty shoulder socket. "You ugly bit." Reynard's cry was cut off by yet another arm flying, taking with it yet another slice of the collapsed building. Just as Aina was about to finally land, her leg angled forward, the sole of her feet slamming Reynard's face into the steel and concrete below. The entire building collapsed as Aina and Reynard followed it to the ground. But, unlike Aina who stood on Reynard's head, the latter had his face buried into the rubble. Bang! The distant armies watched this scene in apprehension. Was this the strength someone should have in the fourth dimension? The only thing they had to comfort themselves was that though Earth had evolved, their buildings were still in the third dimension. They wouldn't have been part of the strengthened. Aina could have crushed Reynard's head to a pulp. But, instead, She wrenched his head up from the ground by his long black hair, fury coloring her face. Aina slammed her axe into the ground, running her free palm across its blade. Her blood trickled like gorgeous rubies. Beautiful seemed like the last word you'd use to describe such a thing, yet her live's liquid truly reflected like the most pristine gems. Rainred's face was completely destroyed. His nose was so bent it had gone flat, his teeth shattered like glass, and even his jaw seemed to have been dislocated. He wanted to cry out in pain, but he couldn't even make a sound without feeling even more pain. His moans came out in whimpers, his body trembling. But this was just the beginning of his torture. Aina yanked his broken jaw open, half ripping it from its hinges completely. Her blood fell down what remained of his throat, causing him to shudder. She released her grip, letting him fall to the ground and watching on coldly. Soon, Reynard began to writhe, his body violently convulsing. Even without his jaw and much of his tongue, he finally found the strength to cry out. However, his cries were distorted, reaching up into the skies as though he was a dying beast. Chapter 577. Rainred's shrill cries bore into the soul of all those who heard them. He wanted to claw at his throat, anything to get that foul blood out of his body, but without his arms, he had no ability to do so. He wiggled against the earth, trying to use the dirt, gravel and concrete in place of his hands. Blue veins surged through his body, crawling up his neck like grotesque worms wiggling beneath his skin. Bang! Bang! He bashed his head against the ground, his own face deforming even more even beneath the strain. Aina picked her axe up from the ground, using the buildings as leverage to leap back up to Lionel, who was still in the sky. They both gazed down toward Reynard, but neither spoke a single word. Lionel's teeth clenched hard. Even after Reynard accidentally pierced through his own throat with a sharp bit of rusted steel, he still didn't feel like it was enough. He watched with a cold expression as Reynard bled himself dry, his convulsions and gurgling cries etching themselves into the memories of all those who heard them. Just as his life was about to fade, Lionel reached out a hand, a strong surge of soul force tearing into Reynard's mind. At that moment, shrieks only Lionel could hear resounded. Even in the last minutes before his death, Reynard experienced pain the likes of which he never thought possible. All of his pride and haughtiness had long since vanished. If he could have, he would have begged and pleaded. Lionel closed his eyes, watching the final moments of those he once thought of as friends, knowing they wouldn't be coming back. Pisces. Lionel's heart trembled. He wanted to see blood. Hutch's body floated face first in the waters, 3 corpses pooling around him. He struggled up, but his body was simply layered with too many injuries. Under the suppression, the pain he had experienced at the hands of these 3 was unimaginable. But, even then he managed to take one of them down even before the puppet master relinquished his control. After Lionel succeeded in drawing that bastard out, the battle should have been easy. But, by then, the old man had already suffered too many injuries. He had no choice but to go all out near the end to eventually squeeze out a victory. That final effort left him without anything left. He could hardly keep hold of his machete or even flip himself face up, let alone stand. The old man flipped over eventually, his wounds spurting with blood. He didn't have the courage to look around, but he was sure that the death count wasn't small. Unfortunately, this battlefield didn't gain the support of the Empire like the capital had. "I'll just take a nap." If the old man was honest with himself, he really wasn't sure if he'd wake up from this one. "Grandfather." Hutch continued to float in the water, facing the slowly rising sun. But, he didn't have the strength to open his eyes. In contrast, Ellerin was still wearing his pristine white tracksuit. There didn't seem to be even the slightest speck of dust on him. His hands were buried in his pockets, looking up at the rising sun as though he was doing it alongside his grandfather. Whether he was aware that Hutch's eyes were closed or not was unknown. After a while, Ellerin crouched down, Hutch's weak snoring traveling to his ears. He grabbed onto his grandfather's machete. Even in such a state, it took him no small amount of strength to pry it free. Ellerin looked from the blade to his sleeping grandfather. Though his arm and wrist were incomparably steady, his index fingers trembling gave him away. He had always had a habit of holding onto a machete with just 3 fingers and his thumb, his index finger pointed parallel to the blade. In his youth, his grandfather had tried to beat this habit out of him, claiming it destabilized his strikes. But, even after so long, Ellerin had never managed to get away from this habit. As he grew up, he found breaking out of this habit only became more difficult. Ellerin rose his grandfather's blade to the latter's throat, the trembling of his index finger only growing. In all of this, though, he looked no different from a youth kneeling by his only remaining family. His face was expressionless, his gaze steady. However, the trembling of his index finger only grew. The blade rested against Hutch's neck. Just a little pressure and one of the body's most vital arteries would be cut. As a veteran of war, it was simply impossible for Hutch to not sense something with the end of his life so near. But there were 2 factors holding him back. The first was that he was simply too tired, he had no strength to speak of left. And the second was that there were few people he trusted more than his own grandson. At that moment, Ellerin suddenly looked off into the distance. A surfboard shot through the skies, a furious aura being carried along with it. The sea's surface alone seemed to boil beneath this might, the stilling water's surface suddenly beginning to churn once again. Ellerin's wrist shifted, placing the blade down on his grandfather's chest. "Someone come and help my grandfather." He spoke emotionlessly. In swift movements, what remained of the medical units made their way to the old man's side. It soon became obvious that Hacker Hutch had entered a deep coma, but his vitals were stable. They couldn't help but look toward Ellerin in reverence. There was no way the old man should be in such a stable situation. The only explanation was that Ellerin had done something. However, very soon, not many could focus on Ellerin at all. Or, rather, it was as though their attention had been split in 2 directions, no one knowing who the main character of the current situation was. The surfboard came to a grinding halt. Lionel's fury bubbled forth. "Pisces. Get the hell out here." Chapter 578. The appearance of Lionel threw the heavy atmosphere of the Slayer Legion off. Those who recognized him were already surprised enough, but those that didn't were shocked by the sudden change. Was it another enemy? But if that was the case, why did he call out for a single person? However, there was no person who reacted more violently than Pisces herself. How she had managed to survive to this point was a story in and of itself. But, after Ellerin joined their battlefield, playing the role of victim was easy enough. The truth of the matter was that she hadn't technically betrayed the Slayer Legion. Neither Aina nor Lionel was a member of their legion, so selling information about them didn't technically put her in the wrong. Beyond this, most of the witnesses to her folly were dead, having died at Rainred's hands. There were few to even speak on what she had done in the first place. And, even if they did, she would have to be placed on trial according to the rules of the Legion. By the time such a trial began and ended, even if she was found guilty, the punishment would be exceptionally light. Because, once again, she hadn't truly betrayed anyone of the Slayer Legion. Pisces could just as easily argue she was simply trying to get Raynard to lower his guard for the sake of a surprise counterattack, while the counterattack itself was no longer useful considering Ellerin's interference. Even beyond this, the few surviving members that remained in Thunderous Clap and Chasing Wind might have bred a dislike for Pisces after what she did to Lionel, but would the others of the Slayer Legion feel this way as well? This might be evidence to them to be distrustful of her, but to the other members of the Slayer Legion, she had granted a great service. In fact, in their eyes, the evil character wasn't Pisces, but rather Lionel himself, who refused to hand over such a treasure for the sake of the greater good. And now, with Hutch having sunk into a coma, there wasn't even a person remaining to speak reason. However, Lionel didn't care about any of this. It was precisely because he knew there would be no justice if he didn't appear personally that he had come here. Thunderous Clap and Chasing Wind, who had had near-dead expressions by this point, suddenly lit up hearing Lionel's voice. In some way or another, this young man had been in their thoughts for months since they last saw him. And now, he had suddenly appeared to redress their grievances. But, as soon as their gazes lit up, they dimmed down once more. even though the Slayer Legion had been decimated, there were still tens of thousands remaining on this battlefield. Beyond this, there was no way they would allow an outsider to kill Pisces before them all, even if she was truly in the wrong, let alone the fact there was no real tangible evidence that she was other than their testimonies. And, even in that case, her actions wouldn't warrant a death penalty. Now, Lionel's own life was in danger. They didn't know how he had managed to learn of what happened, or if he was only here because Pisces had caused him to be hunted down, but regardless of what it was, this matter wouldn't end so simply. Lionel. Supreme Monet slowly rose, nursing a limp left arm that had been thoroughly bandaged. But, even now, her gaze was lit afire, the air around her crackling. Her abilities had been severely hampered due to the environment. But, even now she remembered the humiliating words Lionel had spoken to her all those months ago. In fact, because of how many had died under her command, her prestige in the Slayer Legion had taken a massive dip downward. Of course, how would she ever deem to blame herself for such a thing? In her mind, she had long since held Lionel responsible. Catras pulled himself up, his empty arm sleeve waving about in the salty winds. He could no longer take out his rage on Hutch without becoming a traitor to the entire Legion, but that wouldn't stop him from taking it out on Lionel. Badger's gaze locked onto Lionel, fury from Mayfly's death causing his silver wings to tremble. The waters beneath his feet separated, strong winds spreading apart in all directions. It seemed as though if he was left to his own devices, he wouldn't be satisfied until a tsunami was formed around him. The surprise about Lionel's arrival soon gave way to a surging tide of animosity as those who had grudges with him locked on. Any fatigue they felt was washed away with the low tide, seemingly prepared to pounce at Lionel at any moment. If it wasn't for the stifling murderous intent and Lionel's blatant disregard of them, maybe some would have already attacked. At that moment, Pisces finally breathed a sigh of relief. She finally realized that she would be safe. So what if Lionel was pissed? What could he do in the face of so many elites? He had only brought 2 people and he himself seemed to be in a sorry state. His face was so pale that it seemed as though he might collapse at any time. It was at that exact moment that Lionel's senses finished scanning over the battlefield and landed on Pisces. Pisces felt as though her head had been dunked into a vat of ice. Her body shivered, goosebumps raced across her skin, her knees almost completely giving way as she nearly collapsed. Lionel shot forward, his actions quick and abrupt. No one had expected for him to suddenly dive into an army full of hostility toward him. However, just as Lionel was about to reach Pisces, a figure suddenly and silently appeared before her. He stood indifferently, his hands in his pockets and his white track suit still being just as spotless. Lionel's senses flickered, his surfboard coming to a grinding halt. "Get the hell out of my way." Lionel's voice dripped with cold, causing Elleren's brow to furrow. This definitely wasn't how many normally reacted to his presence. As though finding a pillar to lean on, Pisces snapped. "Show some respect." Pisces spoke in a shrill voice. Young Supreme Elleren is one of the 4 heroes of Earth. He was the second fastest in clearing the first zones. Pisces' knees went weak when Lionel's gaze swept over her, but she managed to glare back, her lip curling into a sneer. "If that's the basis of your confidence, just take your own life now." "Second place." Lionel's growl traveled across the battlefield. "Who the hell do you think was first?" Chapter 579. A stunned silence gripped at Pisces' throat. It wasn't just her. The mystery of who first was had pervaded the people of Earth and their enemies for a long time. But, no one had managed to find the truth. At this point, one might wonder how it was everyone was so certain about the positions of Elleren, Noah, and the mysterious 4th individual. The truth was that the so-called heroes of Earth were only chosen among the youths. One had to remember that Lionel's first entry to a zone was vastly different from all the other instances. He was first transported to another world before falling into a coma for several days. Only after this was he able to enter a zone of his own accord. If one thought about it, this was completely different from any other experience Lionel had had, and there was a reason for this. This mysterious world they had been taken to was the core of Earth. The only ones allowed to enter this space had been youths mature enough to make their own decisions but immature enough to not have reached their full potential yet. As for what criteria a world used to come to this conclusion, it was impossible to tell. But, the more talented a world, the more accurate its judgment would be in this regard. Ultimately, only youths chosen by the world would gain this chance. This was where the mysterious fog of that time came into play. Back then, among the youths who had fallen into a coma with him, Lionel received by far the smallest portion of this fog-like energy while Aina received the vast majority. This mysterious energy was a very special type of universal force known as world force. Its role in that instant of time was to aid in the awakening of one's ability to their greatest potential. So then, one might ask why it was Lionel received such a small portion. The answer was obvious: Lionel's ability had awakened long before the metamorphosis. He simply didn't need this energy. If it wasn't for his father locking his ability away in his youth, it would have grown far beyond the measure it was at currently. However, such a powerful existence on Earth too early wasn't a good thing either. Lionel's presence alone would have sped up Earth's evolution by too large of a margin. Beyond this, there were various reasons why evolving a powerful ability on a weak world would be a detriment to Lionel as well. Ultimately, Lionel awoke far earlier than everyone else as a result of this and as such cleared his zone long before. How did others know the order? That was by judging who exited first. However, when receiving his rewards, Ellerin learned that he was actually second. This was the hidden truth. The overseers of that treasured world of white weren't as tight-lipped as one would expect, but Uncle Montez never spoke of Lionel. So, while others found various channels to learn of who second through fourth were, no one ever learned who first was, until this very moment. "You're lying," Pisces screeched. Laymen might not understand the value of the four heroes, but those of the Slayer Legion were painfully aware. On any other world, these four would be the pillars that upheld the world spirit. However, on Earth, even though there was no world spirit to split, these four represented the four most talented youths of their world. But, what was truly the most shocking to Pisces was that she had no idea Lionel didn't have a fourth of the world spirit. If it was such widespread knowledge, there was no way Terrain wouldn't have stumbled upon this information. So, in the face of such words, it felt as though she was facing a man capable of grasping the fate of their world. Lionel didn't bother to respond to Pisces, his gaze locking onto Ellerin. For this man to force him to stop his forward momentum despite his rage, there was no doubt that he was radiating a large amount of danger. But, Lionel had no intention of letting these matters rest so simply. If he did nothing, he felt as though his heart would burst from his chest. His blood ran even hotter now than when he used his Scarlet Star Force. "I won't say it again," Lionel said coldly, looking into Ellerin's blue eyes. Ellerin silently scanned Lionel. This man was first. Ellerin had always trusted his intuition, and his intuition told him that Lionel wasn't lying. In fact, if Lionel wasn't in such a rage-induced state, he might have not even bothered to speak such words. The members of the Slayer Legion can't be casually dealt with by outsiders. Outsiders? Lionel sneered deep into the point of being overcast by darkness. According to my simulations, there's a 97% chance the Slayer Legion is a hidden card that reports directly to the royal family. Ellerin's pupils constricted into pinholes, staring toward Lionel with a tinge of extra alertness. If you were an independent organization, not only wouldn't you be at a head with the hidden families, but you would also have allied with Terrain instead of battling them to your near deaths. So try me again. Tell me how this prince of the empire is an outsider. Pisces and others who had been in the dark felt as though bells were resonating in their minds. Lionel had no idea he had just revealed a secret kept for centuries, nor did he care. Today, Pisces would die. Ellerin regained his calm after a moment, his gaze becoming indifferent. Unfortunately for you, Prince, even if such a thing were true, it would have been a secret maintained for hundreds of years and we would be an organization that only reported directly to the Emperor himself. You, even as a prince, for the crime of revealing such a matter, would be executed. That's how the story would go, no? Lionel's expression only became colder. However, just as he was about to attack, the world suddenly trembled, the sound of a shattering barrier radiating down from the skies. The energies whined, reality bending and twisting beneath an inconceivable might. And then, a voice that traveled to all corners of their fold of reality spoke to them all. Under the decree of Shield Cross Stars, Lionel Morales is to be classified as a Tier 4 fugitive, found guilty for the crime of colluding with a variant invalid. The fugitive has 2 hours to hand himself in, or his charges will be increased to Tier 3. The bounty is set to 10,000 kilograms of 5th-dimensional herb. End of Book 3. Chapter 580. Half a day ago Era stumbled out of a teleportation gate, her knees feeling weak. A mixture of emotions seemed to ram against her skull, causing her to keel over, the contents of her stomach emptying out before her. She heaved and coughed, her elegant demeanor twisting to nothing every time she remembered Anared wouldn't be coming back. After a long while, when her heaves reaped nothing but dry coughs, she stood, wiping her mouth with her forearm. If those who wrote tales of this goddess-like woman were to see her now, it was hard to tell how they'd react. Era took a look around the world she was on currently. But, after a moment, it became clear that it would be hard to call this place a world at all. Rather, it was an asteroid floating aimlessly in space. If it wasn't for the force arts protecting her from the cold and especially the fearsome astral wind force, she would have died 100 different ways by now. Her appearance hadn't gone unnoticed. This was a small relay hub, the location of which was usually only known to bounty hunters and the like. So, it could be said that their alertness was as high as it came. Plus, considering the small size of the asteroid, they would be far too incompetent to miss the sight of a grieving and vomiting beauty. The hub was made of nothing more than what looked like a gas station. As for what kind of vehicles it fueled, it was hard to tell. But, from the outside, it didn't seem to be as important as it truly was. Era stumbled forward, the change of gravity not helping her case in the slightest. But, she still managed to make it to a dwarf-like man who seemed to be napping. The short man reclined on a chair, his face covered by a newspaper. Even after Era got close, he still didn't react. "Give me a communication channel," Era said coldly. The dwarf-like man shifted slightly, a single groggy eye peeking out from behind the folds of his slipping newspaper. But before he could speak, Era slipped a ring off her finger and threw it at him. The man seemed to finally awaken, snatching the ring out of the air with movements that were far too nimble. Without a word, he hooked his finger toward a narrow wooden outhouse that exuded a foul stench. Era stumbled toward it without a word. She didn't seem to give a damn about the smell as she barged in, not even glancing toward the filth filling the toilet bowl. She reached for a rusted phone hanging above that seemed to have appeared from thin air. With nimble fingers, she dialed numbers in quick succession, her demeanor becoming calmer and calmer by the second. It was as though every number she clicked sealed away another portion of her soul, chaining away emotions that she had just worn out in the open. "Hello." It seemed to be a greeting, but the voice on the other side seemed as distant as possible. "Commander Saga." "Ah, Miss Era. It's surprising that you've called me directly this time. Finally had enough of manipulating my subordinates?" Era didn't seem to react much to this accusation. "It seems you have quite a lot of time on your hands despite being a quadrant overseer. Paying attention to a little world-like terrain is beneath you, don't you think? Normally that would be so, but who asked them to be so lucky as to be so close to Earth? Are you sure that's the only reason?" Era sneered. "Or is it more related to a certain Lionel Morales?" Scythe's voice took a long pause, not responding immediately. But, when he did, his voice carried a bone-chilling cold. "Sometimes knowing too much isn't good, Miss Era. There's a reason men don't like women who are too smart for their own good. Then he'll be a good little girl for you and speak on things that may or may not be true. I'm just a woman, after all. How could I know any of these things for certain?" Era replied just as coldly. "First, it may be true that Lionel is the first hero everyone has been looking for all this time. And, it may be true that no one has been able to confirm this due to the fact his assigned overseer has kept their mouth closed. This may mean that he is extraordinarily favored, and this just might mean that for this overseer to resist temptation despite the price for such information that they are at the very least from a higher sixth-dimensional world, most likely a seventh-dimensional world. Saga grew quiet. But, the slight creaking of the phone beneath his palm didn't escape Era's notice in the slightest. It was quite obvious that this was the first time Saga had made such a connection. This was about as good as Lionel having the favor of a seventh-dimensional world. For him to step into such a matter, he was no different from the pawns he had been using from Terrain's headquarters all this time. Anyone who understood politics knew that the purpose of keeping Lionel's title secret wasn't to hide the title itself, rather, it was a silent warning, a hidden blade in the darkness. The purpose from the very beginning wasn't to hide the title, it was a beacon to not touch a hair on his head. Then what might you suggest? Saga Era's lip curled, a cold light flashing within her gaze. There are some crimes that no amount of status can protect you from. That's bullshit and you know it. Saga said coldly. Try and manipulate me again and I'll leave this call immediately. Era's smile didn't fade. Fine. She said lightly. How about this then? The universe is a vast place. How possible do you think it is to pay attention to every corner? I have a certain variant invalid that thought too highly of himself. And you have control of a certain quadrant in a small corner of the Milky Way. Why don't we form a partnership? You don't have much of a choice, right? Saga fell silent. How ironic, just minutes before this call, he was thinking of how to use his subordinates as scapegoats, now he was in their shoes. That was true. The higher-ups of Shield Cross Stars might not care to offend a seventh-dimensional world, but what about him? This must be what they call karma. And now, if he wanted a way out, he would have to make a deal with this she-devil. Chapter 581. Aina looked up into the skies, a picture of rage on her face. It wasn't long before the flickering lights in the clouds coalesced into an image of Lionel. The image seemed to carry no life, as though it was a clone of Lionel rather than a depiction of him. But, there was no doubt that this was in fact Lionel. By some magic, this singular image was viewable all across the spherical planet. A simple look upward was enough to gaze upon it. Rather than a wanted poster, it felt as though Earth was being branded for Lionel's sins, almost like it was their burden to deal with such a traitor. Lionel, too, looked into the skies. For some reason, all his rage, all his anger, seemed to vanish in the blink of an eye. It was as though he was a completely different person, expressionlessly gazing at the skies as though the image above wasn't of himself. He stood there in silence for a long while. For some reason, despite hearing the name and seeing the face, those of the Slayer Legion didn't move to immediately apprehend Lionel. It would be fine if they weren't aware of the value of 10,000 kilograms of herb ore, but they were most definitely aware. There were no conversions for fourth and fifth dimensional herb Oregon. Simply put, even all the fourth dimensional herb ore in existence couldn't be pooled together to buy even a single fifth dimensional Oregon. Of course, things weren't so exaggerated. There were certainly some powers that would find a certain amount worth it. But, all the most powerful worlds would never trade downward. What did this mean? It essentially meant that fourth-dimensional treasures could only be bought with fourth-dimensional herb ore, while if one wanted fifth-dimensional treasures, only fifth-dimensional herb ore could buy them. What did 10,000 kilograms of fifth-dimensional herb ore represent? It represented multiple fifth-dimensional treasures. Not just multiple, but multiple high-grade fifth-dimensional treasures. Even with all of Earth's talent and the support they received, there was not a single fifth-dimensional treasure on their world. Yet, even with such temptation, for some reason, it felt like there was an invisible force field around him that even Aina couldn't break through. He stood there silently, looking into the skies with a blank expression. The rage in his blood cooled, the wild beating of his heart slowed, the fury that had a steel grip on his mind dissipated. Is this what power is? Lionel thought to himself. To be able to say whatever you wanted, regardless of what the truth was. To trample on the efforts of those beneath you for the sake of your own benefit. To brazenly look down on the weak, sneering with a face of victory as though daring them to do something. Lionel had never felt smaller, and it was ironically while watching such a large projection of himself. Lionel suddenly began to laugh. In the silent atmosphere, it was truly jarring. A young man who was already the center of attention became even more so. His laughter was one part sorrowful, one part self-deprecating, and a final part as though he truly found all of this to be funny. That was right, seeing his face up there after putting his life on the line to eliminate a threat that may very well have ravaged this galaxy in the future was outright hilarious. Aina looked toward Lionel a bit worriedly. She wasn't sure how to console him. It felt like Lionel's worldviews were crumbling before her eyes, but she didn't know how to put the pieces back together. If Lionel had reacted any other way, she'd feel much better. If he was uncaring, she'd be uncaring too. If he was furious, she would brandish her axe to redress his grievances. But how was she supposed to react to this laughter? Shield cross stars. Lionel mumbled, his voice somewhat hollow. At that moment, the skies suddenly split apart. A platform of black appeared, slowly making its way out. On just a cursory glance, it looked no different from a military ship to be docked in the ocean, prepared to launch fighter jets. Except this ship took the skies as its waters and its fighter jets were instead replaced by row after row of soldiers. What once was a uniform Lionel thought looked quite cool now looked no different from rags in his eyes. He felt his stomach churn laying his eyes on such a formation, not out of fear, but rather, disgust. Lionel didn't move. He didn't really think there was a point. His sensitivity to space was magnified several times over thanks to his part-completed divine armor. He could tell that their fold of reality had been completely sealed by some inconceivable strength. Beyond that, a world seemed to be vast with plenty of places to hide, but Lionel somehow felt that Earth had suddenly become extremely tiny. As though a noose was tightening around his neck, he simply stood there, laughing. By the time his laughter faded, the massive airship had completely exited whatever void it had come out from. At the helm, Commander Saga stood, his face still the same pale, placid color. He looked like a man who always did everything by the book, and the warriors to his back seemed to believe this as well, having no idea what schemes their supposedly respected leader was pulling. However, it was at that moment that the color of the world seemed to shift. From the vibrant colors of dawn, only shades of black and white remained. A dignified voice filled the skies. It sounded one part ancient and filled with wisdom, while simultaneously holding the momentum of an undefeatable war god. It was the kind of voice that ingrained itself onto the soul, never to be forgotten. To enter my domain and demand the head of my grandson, how brazen indeed. A hand appeared. It must have been at least 10 kilometers tall and 5 wide. It swirled with the only colors that remained of the world, appearing above the massive flying ship like a deity descending from above. Boom! The flying ship shattered into several pieces, what was left of it crashing to the ground below like a rain of meteors. Earth is not a world you can step into as you please. Chapter 582. The change was so abrupt that hardly anyone knew how they should react to the suddenness. In one moment devastating pressure was hanging over Earth, and in the next, it was as though it had been washed away by the warmth of a protector. The life and death of the warriors who had just been valiantly riding the air ship were completely unknown. Many the only person who was aware of the answer to the question aside from the men themselves was Emperor Fox. The hand slowly faded from the skies, but the voice of the Emperor didn't, hanging in the air for just a moment longer. Lionel, you've avoided this old man for long enough, don't you think? These words lingered, reverberating through the minds of all those who heard it. Lionel himself didn't move for a long while as though he couldn't hear the words of this grandfather of his at all. Instead, he had the same thought for the second time that day. In fact, this time, it reverberated in his mind with an even greater fervor. Is this what power is? Lionel suddenly felt a small hand slip into his. This time, it didn't wash away all the discomfort he was feeling, but at the very least, it gave him something to lean upon somewhat. His gaze shifted from the skies to the petite young lady standing to his side. Something about her presence gave him the room he needed to breathe easier. Lionel squeezed her hand lightly. Little Black Star. At that moment, a shadow suddenly blazed a trail by Lionel's side. Before Pisces could react, she found a hole where her heart should have been. The little mink flashed, appearing to stand on Lionel's shoulder with a beating heart in his hands. It looked toward the shocked Pisces, its little paws digging into the dripping heart. Pisces watched on in horror, her body visibly trembling. Why? Why me? She never thought that a small bout of jealousy would really lead to her death in this way. She had just wanted to grow stronger. Wasn't she allowed to want such a thing? Ironically, Lionel ended up adding his own strokes to the cruelty of this world. Lionel and Aina rose into the skies, leaving over the horizon. But, from start to finish, Ellerin didn't make a single move. The other Slayer Legion members who hated Lionel's guts could only watch on in fury. But, after seeing the Emperor's prowess, and even hearing that he had specifically stepped out to protect Lionel, which of them would truly dare to move at this point? However, hidden within his pockets, Ellerin's index finger continued to twitch, illusions of slicing the little mink in two replaying in his thoughts. The palace was just as grand as Lionel remembered. Though he had only appeared before it for a moment previously, it was most definitely enough for him to never forget the impression it had left on him. And, despite the fact he was enraged at the time, it most definitely left a grand impression. If it wasn't the overwhelming presence of the palace, Lionel would have found it far more difficult to ignore the fact a battle was still raging on below. Of course, this battle wasn't as explosive as it had been when Lionel first stepped foot onto it, with what remaining just being petty skirmishes, but it was a battle nonetheless. Lionel almost felt bad for flying over it without lifting a finger to help. But, something told him that he couldn't delay going to see his grandfather this time. Though it seemed that everything had already been handled, Lionel was far from naive enough to believe this. The moment Lionel stepped foot into the highest layer, he felt as though he had entered an all-new world. Despite the fact a war for a world was occurring below, the main core of the capital seemed completely unaffected. It was hard to tell how someone of terrain would react to seeing such a thing. But, then again, they probably had their hands full wrapping their minds around the strength Emperor Fox just displayed. When Lionel landed before the palace, he found that the roads paved of wealth that led to its doors were lined with warriors, each exuding a dangerous aura. It felt that if even just 10 of these men and women stepped toward to the outside world, the war would be as good as over. Yet, they all stood here, valiantly guarding the entrance of the Emperor's home. At the side of the grand doors, a spectacled man stood, his hands clasped behind his back. The only word Lionel could think of when he looked upon him was disciplined. The man was so cleanly shaven that Lionel could almost feel the suppleness of his skin with his eyes alone. His white gold hair was done up in an elaborate royal style and his emerald eyes hid behind a pair of glasses that seemed carved of diamond. His dress was immaculate. Even with his senses, Lionel couldn't find a single wrinkle on his person. This man frowned slightly when he saw Aina by Lionel's side. But, as though receiving some sort of order, he decided to ignore it. Without a word, he turned into the palace, leading Lionel and Aina through the grand halls. From start to finish, his steps were even and measured without even a centimeter of deviation. For a man like Lionel who was used to seeing the world as an accumulation of numbers, this was baffling. Soon, Lionel and Aina were led into the depths of the palace, only to make their way through another opening and find themselves in what seemed to be yet another world. Chirping birds, rushing waters that glittered of rainbow colors, and lush greenery. The entire garden seemed to breathe with vitality, inhaling and exhaling to the rhythm of the world. At the center of this garden sat an old man Lionel couldn't take his eyes off. No, he almost felt that it was inappropriate to call him old. This supposed old-timer was brimming with more vitality than even Lionel himself. Imperial Father, I have brought them. The spectacled man bowed reverentially even as Lionel raised an eyebrow. It was only now that he understood that this almost too well-groomed individual was his uncle. Chapter 583. Lionel quietly observed his grandfather. This was the first time he was meeting the man, yet he somehow felt a sense of familiarity with him. At first, Lionel thought that this was his dream force dragging up memories for him once again. But, after a while, he understood that this wasn't actually the case. Dream force helped his memory to be near infallible. Yet, even with it, his recollections of the man before him were blurry at best. Something like that seemed impossible to Lionel. With the presence of this man, how could he possibly ever be forgotten? He had an air that seemed to outshine the sun itself. It felt as though even if he was in the depths of space, without even the slightest hint of light, he would still radiate with his own brilliance. The longer Lionel observed him, the brighter Emperor Fox's amiable smile seemed to become. He felt more and more satisfied with every passing second. Lionel's uncle, however, frowned at the current situation. Standing before the emperor without a word or even an attempt to bow. This was no small amount of disrespect. If it was anyone else, the prince would have long since lashed out. But, this time, he refrained for no other reason than the fact Lionel was his nephew. That said, that didn't stop his impression of Lionel from taking a large dip downward. Bowing in this situation was more than about showing respect to an emperor, it was also a means of showing respect for your predecessors. But, clearly Lionel didn't have this modicum of respect. Lionel, however, wasn't thinking so far. It was just that after his experience with King Arthur, he had gained a dislike of kneeling and bowing. In addition, he hadn't grown up in the same culture as this uncle of his. Lionel had never bowed to even his own father a single day in his life, but this was also part of the reason he hadn't taken kneeling or not kneeling very seriously in the past. In fact, even now, Lionel didn't think kneeling was a big deal. It was just that he had gained a subtle dislike for it, the same way someone might not like a flavor of ice cream. There was no need to do it if he didn't care for it, the same way there was no reason someone wouldn't go out of their way to eat a flavor of ice cream they weren't fond of. Soon, the odd atmosphere was suddenly broken by Emperor Fox's laughter. It seems you've grown up well. You're still quite weak-minded, but you shouldn't be very far from a breakthrough in that respect. You're only in need of a little push. Lionel's brows rose. What was any of that supposed to mean? He wasn't quite sure, if he was being honest. Was he weak-minded? Well, he couldn't exactly be objective in answering this question. But, from an outsider's perspective, the answer was most definitely yes. Lionel had yet to truly mature yet, and his reaction towards Shield Cross Stars coming after him in such a fashion only painted this truth clearer. However, despite the fact he was practically blatantly insulted to his face, Lionel didn't have an adverse reaction. Emperor Fox's gaze shifted to Aina, a light smile on his face. Despite the fact she had put her mask back on, she still felt as though she was being seen through completely. She couldn't help but shiver slightly, her grip on Lionel's hand tightening. The action startled Lionel a bit. This wasn't because Aina used too much strength, but rather because he had almost completely forgotten she was by his side, as though his grandfather had become his whole world. The emperor chuckled. There's no need to be nervous, little girl. Though I know about your family, I'm also aware that you want to see them destroyed just as much as I do. In such a case, why would I do something to a young lady my grandson has taken a fancy to? For some reason, despite the words of comfort, Aina's grip on Lionel's hand only tightened, as though trying to remind him not to forget her again. Emperor Fox turned his attention back toward Lionel. So, you've angered Shield Cross Stars? Lionel remained silent for a while, but in the end, he could only nod. That was the only explanation for what had just happened, right? Emperor Fox chuckled. Shield Cross Stars does indeed have the capital to ignore the wishes of the Morales clan to a certain extent. But, I'm afraid that they didn't enter this situation knowing they were facing a potential heir. They are still treating you as a normal talent of Earth. However, they seem to believe that you've gained favor of a much larger entity. Unfortunately for them, this belief leaves many loopholes in their approach. Lionel's gaze brightened slightly. It seems you understand already. Emperor Fox said with a light smile. Your strength isn't small. Lionel finally spoke. A grandfather hearing such words from his grandson should be grinning ear to ear, but why is it that I don't feel as happy as I should? Emperor Fox's teasing words were clearly aimed for Lionel. Though Lionel's words seemed to be praising him, they carried a hint of melancholy and a blaming tone. But, how could they not? The Emperor's words had an obvious hidden meaning to Lionel. He was saying that Shield Cross Stars was making use of their subordinates as scapegoats to deal with him. When it came down to it, they would just hand over the culprit and wipe their hands clean. But, by taking this approach, they had to veil their movements. What did this mean? It could mean anything from only releasing information about Lionel to a small segment of the universe to strong-arming a weak world like Earth into handing him over. Clearly, the second option had failed, so they would very likely progress to the former, all to maintain the illusion that these were the actions of a rogue subordinate and nothing else. However, the reason they had failed in their first attempt couldn't have been clearer. The Fox family was far more powerful than they had initially thought. But, that truth left another elephant in the room. Once again, Emperor Fox had so much strength at the tips of his fingers, but he was more than content with allowing those he could have protected to die one after another. And this time, people Lionel once called friend were among them. Chapter 584. Another silence fell over the gardens as Lionel didn't respond immediately. But, it was clear that this was less about Lionel not wanting to respond and more about him being uncertain of how to. His grandfather had just saved his life. There was no way around this was the truth of the matter. Was it truly so easy to spit in the face of someone who had done such a thing for you, especially when your personality was like Lionel's? But at that same time, Lionel had been growing such animosity for this very same grandfather of his for so long. Yet, just when he had the opportunity to give the man a piece of his mind, this happened. It was as though the world was playing a joke on him. That said, Lionel also didn't feel right just welcoming this grandfather with open arms. All of his actions ran diametrically opposed to everything Lionel stood for. If you have such strength, why do you never do anything with it? Lionel finally spoke, his gaze matching his grandfather's. He didn't particularly have any anger to speak of. In fact, it was currently just as emotionless as it was when he was in the midst of battle. But maybe, in some ways, this was exactly that. Just another battle. What Lionel didn't expect after he said these words, though, was for a stifling aura to suddenly envelop him. However, it became very clear, very quickly that this aura wasn't from his grandfather. But, rather, from this silent uncle of his. Still, this aura that felt like a wall of water became a drizzle just as quickly as it took for Lionel's grandfather to raise his hand. Emperor Fox's smile never faded even as he lowered his hand. He continued to observe Lionel the same way he always had. Yet, for some reason, despite the fact there wasn't even a hint of change in his smile, Lionel still felt as though the situation had completely shifted. When Emperor Fox finally spoke again, a slight cold breeze seemed to sweep the spring gardens. To ask someone else why they didn't use their own strength as they please. Don't you find this to be very weak? Lionel matched his grandfather's gaze but didn't say a thing. However, that didn't mean that a certain Aina wasn't enraged by such an answer. If it wasn't for the fact Lionel hadn't released her hand and she knew that they weren't safe to lash out in such an environment, she would have long since done so. I expected more from you. Emperor Fox said lightly. This isn't a world where you can say such things. Not only is it the pinnacle of foolishness, these thoughts will one day get you killed. Lionel once again didn't lash out at these words. He replied simply and just as emotionlessly. It's foolish to ask you, as an emperor, to protect your citizens? Emperor Fox put up another hand preemptively. This time, he sent a look toward his son, warning him that this should be the last time he should waste his time doing such a thing. The imperial prince swallowed his rage and stood in place, his back ramrod straight and his gaze locked onto Lionel. If others who knew of his personality were here, there was no doubt that they would be shocked beyond belief. This was a man who was known for his stoicism no matter what the situation. For him to have lost his temper not just once, but twice, and even in such quick succession. It could only be said that this man was truly protective of his father, even if the one he was protecting the emperor from was his very own nephew. The weak do not have a voice. They do not have the right to demand, nor do they have any right to direct the actions of the strong. Lionel indifferently listened to these words. Didn't he already know this? Existences like the Empire and the Slayer Legion made it as clear as possible. Those with strength could survive, while those who were weak could only scramble for scraps. Hard work? Perseverance? It didn't seem to be worth a damn in this world. If you weren't born with backing, talent, or both, you were finished. In fact, Lionel would have long since died dozens of times over if not for having such things in his corner. However, he felt that this was wrong. Why was his life more valuable than others? Why was it that he could stand here while his friends had to be buried? Emperor Fox replied simply. However, before Lionel could even think of responding, he continued. Such words won't get through to you. And, quite frankly, I hate explaining myself the most. An air of suffocating majesty filled the garden. Even Lionel couldn't help but feel his knees buckle somewhat. This sort of presence. It was far beyond his own. If it wasn't for a worthless pride that had bubbled forth from within him, unwilling to give in to his grandfather's ideals, he may very well have fallen in that very moment. However, you are my grandson, yet I have never been a part of your life. Consider my next words as payment for this missed time. After this, you can consider our relationship as neutrally as you please. The pressure bore down on Lionel. Sweat poured from his back, his spine trembling. You must blame me for the Paradise Island incidents. Yet, why is it that you don't assign the same blame to your father? Was he not knowledgeable about the situation? In fact, he's quite a bit more powerful than I am. If he wanted to, he likely could have waited until the metamorphosis began and slaughtered every invalid on the planet before going on his way. But I guess that much is just a small matter. What about the things he left behind for you? I'm sure they would help someone much weaker than yourself protect their lives. Why is it that you've kept it for yourself? If the Slayer Legion had those treasures, I'm sure less people would have died and your friends would have been saved. I guess that much can be passed off as a small matter as well. But, in addition to not doing your best to help the Slayer Legion stave off casualties, you just murdered a young lady who was only trying her best to survive. Wasn't she among the weak you think the strong should protect? Or is it that the weak you refer to only encompass the people you think are deserving? After all, you are one of the strong. Supposedly. Chapter 585. Lionel felt as though his grandfather's every word was grating on his soul. But he still stood there, his mind wrapped in a steel cage, clearly unwilling to accept the things he was hearing. A part of him would have rather ignored it all. As quick as Lionel's mind was, if he wanted to come with excuses to ignore valid points, he could run circles even around this grandfather of his. His mind was simply too nimble and quick. And, as expected, that was exactly what he did. In no more than a breath of silence, he had already come up with several rebuttals. His father? Wasn't he just restricted by the same things the hidden families were? How could he have interfered if he had rules he wasn't allowed to break? His treasures? If he had handed them in, would they really have helped his friends? Trusting Supreme Monet with his things, would that have really been an intelligent thing to do? Pisces? That backstabbing bitch? Was she really the same as the weak? Why should she be categorized as such? The worst of it all was the fallacy of Emperor Fox's argument. He and Lionel weren't even remotely in the same position. One of them hadn't even known of their noble status until a few weeks ago, while the latter was an emperor of a world. There was a very clear dividing line in their responsibilities. There was no way Lionel should care more about the citizens of Earth than their emperor. Even if Lionel was the most selfish individual there was. So what? His burden wasn't the same as this supposed emperor. Why were they even being compared? However, in the breath it had taken Lionel to think of these things, Emperor Fox had continued speaking as though he had never taken a pause to begin with. Those were the last words he'll say on the topic. If you feel that you would be a better emperor, I am right here. If you can defeat me, the throne is yours. Imperial Father. Lionel's expression finally cracked, replaced by something other than indifference for the first time. This man before him felt like rolling hills that extended to infinity, like an endlessly rising land that shot into the skies, like a lurking beast slumbering as though there was nothing that could gain his interest. Emperor Fox ignored his son. But the weight of this crown isn't something you can carry. You're weak. And worst of all, you don't seem to know that you are. The emperor looked toward Lionel as though he could see through him completely, even down to all the rebuttals he had at the tip of his tongue. But, true to his word, he didn't speak a single word about the topic again. It seemed he wasn't lying. He really did disdain to explain himself. If Lionel felt like he could still squirm his way around his words as though this was a debate rather than real life, that only meant that Lionel was even weaker than even he realized. He had already explained things once. He wouldn't do it again. He had no need for the useless and foolish. The matter of Shield Cross Stars, Emperor Fox continued, you will be safe as long as you are on Earth. My dignity isn't something that can be encroached upon, Shield Cross Stars, or any other. The indifferent declaration seemed to cause the winds to shift. It felt as though the world itself acknowledged the Emperor's words as infallible. Lionel couldn't help but think that it was precisely this old man who had earned the world's spirit before he was born. But, he had no way of confirming such a thing. Then again, the thought that he could display such power without the world's spirit was even more shocking. So, shouldn't he just accept this? When you leave Earth, though, you will be on your own. I doubt that Shield Cross Stars will be as blatant as they have been to this point, but with the death of that Commander Saga, their approach will be more subtle this time. Lionel didn't even know who this Commander Saga was. But, for some reason, hearing his name made him feel as though he was falling further and further into this quagmire that was his grandfather. Those who understood the backstory of this matter would most definitely be shocked beyond belief. Commander Saga had been biding his time to strike at Lionel, yet he had died. Just like that. As though that wasn't shocking enough, Commander Saga was a fifth-dimensional existence. The bounty on your head won't be changing, nor will your fugitive status. That said, that only matters to those who know of it. When it comes down to it, you will have to protect yourself. Lionel felt as though his head was spinning. He had a bounty on his head. But only some people knew about it. He had a fugitive status. But it only mattered to those who knew of it. What did any of that mean? Was he a criminal, or wasn't he? Would he be hunted down, or wouldn't he? What was the truth? The crux of the matter was that, as Era had alluded to, the universe was a vast place. Even with Shield Cross Stars acting as the police force of the dimensional verse, even they didn't move as one unit. They were split into countless quadrants which were even further separated into several overarching factions. Commander Scythe's quadrant was on full alert, the very same quadrant terrain and Earth were located in. Logically, as a person who was now a Tier 3 criminal, Lionel was only just shy of the true scum of the universe. Yet, due to Scythe's actions in deploying the decree, Lionel's status had become more like a ticking time bomb than a falling meteor. If anything, maybe Lionel's most immediate threat was Era. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't have enough information about the universe to complete such thorough analysis. Even to this point, he had no idea how powerful Shield Cross Stars was. He could only find time to interrogate the dictionary. But, he was so lost in his own thoughts, that he didn't even react as he was being escorted out the palace. Even to the end, Emperor Fox really couldn't bother to explain himself in full. The fact he said anything at all was only a testament to the fact Lionel was his grandson. Nothing less, and definitely nothing more. However, as Lionel stood in a daze at the palace gates, his uncle seemingly couldn't continue to bite his tongue. Try not to die, he said coldly. And, while you're out there, try and think of why in a war of such concentrated force, not a single invalid horde appeared from start to finish. The words were like a bomb going off in Lionel's mind. His head snapped backward, but all he saw was his uncle's back view and two large doors slamming shut. Bang! Chapter 586. Lionel sat within the lab setting of the segmented cube, his mind absent. His only company was little Tolly, but seemingly having seen through its master's mood, the little guy was a lot less joyful. It was quite an odd situation to be in. The war for Earth was likely coming to a close even as he sat here. The nightmare that had haunted Aina had been killed by his own hands, and a bounty that should have been hanging over his head was effectively neutered for the time being. Yet, Lionel couldn't find it within himself to be happy in the slightest. In fact, he felt a nagging insecurity eating away at his heart, refusing to let go and filling his chest with a heavy darkness. Uncertainty. It was dangerous enough for a normal human to allow such an emotion to rule them. To fear the unknown and one's future path more than the idea of not taking a step at all was as good as allowing one's life to come to a grinding halt. In a normal world, the worst that could happen would be living out a life of mediocrity. One would become a normal man, wallowing through life with a woe-is-me attitude that wouldn't fade even with age. Such a person would be a perpetual victim for the rest of their lives, blaming their failures on the actions of others and never undergoing any sort of introspection about what personal decisions might have led to their current situation. However, in a world like this, in a new world order where killing and death was just the product of another normal day, such apathy was the root of more than just failure. Left alone with his own thoughts, Lionel spun his own counter-arguments in his mind over and over again. At one point, his numerous thoughts split into two streams, attacking one another from opposite sides as though determined to completely destroy the other side. The more Lionel thought, the more he realized just how flawed his previous thoughts were. His father was restricted the same way the hidden families were restricted? Was that really true? The hidden families were in a completely separate space while his own father could appear on Earth itself. Were they really restricted by the same rules? Was that possible? How convenient was it for him to rely on a set of rules he wasn't even aware of to absolve his father of any guilt? It was laughable at best. At worst, he was a terrible kind of hypocrite, the kind of bastard that would shame one for killing then turn a blind eye when a friend committed the same atrocity. And what about his treasure? Even if he didn't give it to Monet, what was stopping him from giving it to someone else? If he had handed it over to Hutch, an old man he somewhat trusted, what kind of result would there have been? If Hutch had the dictionary, how much easier would his battle against the three heads have been? Would he have been struck down to the point he was in a coma? And if his battle against them was easier, wouldn't that mean that he would be able to end it earlier and save more lives? According to what he saw from Rainred's memories, it was precisely because Hutch had been occupied that he became bold enough to travel into the depths of the army and eventually kill Roaring Black Lion and the others. If he had been less selfish, would they have died? The most complicated of Lionel's thoughts revolved around Pisces, this girl he hated with all his heart. But, if he broke it down to the foundation of why it was he disliked her so much, wasn't it purely because he couldn't stand the fact she survived while those he called friend could only be buried? What was Pisces' worst crime? If Lionel was being objective about it, the worst thing she had done was point Reynard toward Royal Blue Province. This action could have led to a catastrophic outcome had Lionel not dealt with the puppet master. Yet, even then, Reynard hadn't been targeting Royal Blue Province at all when he ran away from Eleron. The province just happened to be the closest piece of land. Regardless of whether he found out this information from Pisces, he would have found out eventually anyway. Just like he had asked for Lionel from those of the Slayer Legion, asking the same question to those of Royal Blue Fort would have had the same impact. However, if Lionel was the most honest with himself, what infuriated him the most about what she did was the most benign action. She had tried to get his treasures taken away. If he broke down that action, sure, it was rooted in a certain selfishness on her part. But, wasn't his rejection of Monet's request also rooted in selfishness? He had no obligation to hand over his things, this much was true. But, if he accepted this premise, what right did he have to dislike his grandfather's actions? Of course, to Lionel, this was about more than just the fact the treasures had value. Tied to these treasures was also the fact his father had entrusted him with them. They could be considered to be the last bit of his parents that he had with him. If he took it one step further, these treasures represented his chance at reuniting with his family. It represented a path toward the strength he would need to save Aina. These all sounded like noble matters. But, what was more demanding? For him to hand over a treasure that would allow him to accomplish his own selfish goal? Or for the strong to risk their lives to protect the weak? If he felt that it was wrong for the Slayer Legion to take away the last piece of his father that he had and cut off his path towards saving Aina, then how could he also not feel it to be wrong for him to expect others to lay their lives on the line for strangers? These thoughts ultimately led to the final nail in Lionel's coffin. The reasoning he had clung to was that his obligations weren't the same as his grandfather's. One of them was a newly minted prince while the other was the emperor of a world. How could they be equated? Lionel had no obligation to be selfless, but wasn't this the role of a ruler? However, the words of his uncle rang in his mind again and again. No invalid hordes. Not even a single sighting. If an invalid horde interfered in the war, Earth would have been finished. When comparing the talented versus the untalented, which would the invalids prefer to target? The people of Earth would end up being attacked from two fronts, completely unable to counter. Even Lionel wouldn't be able to do anything to change this. What right did he have to question Emperor Fox? Chapter 587. Lionel didn't have any answers. He lost himself in endless tinkering, working his way toward the completion of his divine armor. The space-rending abilities of the terrain cities had given him exactly the enlightenment he needed to comprehend the core intricacies he needed to complete his first armor. But, whereas this matter would have given him great satisfaction in the past, knowing that he had come a step closer to bettering his father in force crafting, currently, he completed every step with an almost eerie monotony. Surprisingly, though, this very monotony, the disconnection of his emotions, made his every action even more perfect than they would be usually. He completed everything with a level of precision that existed beyond the realm of humans. Aina entered the lab setting with a hint of worry on her face. Lionel never restricted her movements, so she could enter any location of the segmented cube just as easily as him. Looking at Lionel's back, she wasn't really sure of how to comfort him. The only thing that Aina was sure of was that she didn't want Lionel to change. She didn't want him to become as cold-blooded as the rest of this world. She had said as much when the two were in the Joan zone together. In fact, that moment between them back then was maybe the most honest she had been with him up to that point. However, now, Lionel was stuck in a dilemma he didn't know how to bring himself out of. And it was exactly this sort of matter that Coach Owen had been so worried about. A person without purpose was easily swayed by others. If Lionel had a one-minded pursuit, a dream that was rooted in himself and no one else, how could the words of others so easily sway him? In fact, knowing Lionel, having such an aspiration would make him an untamable monster, an existence the likes of which existed above all others. But at this moment, Lionel still didn't know exactly what that was. And, as though this wasn't bad enough, he wasn't even looking for it. As the saying went, one didn't know what they didn't know. It was impossible for Lionel to see through his shortcomings if he wasn't even sure of what they were. But, ironically, if he was told of what he needed to look for, it just might have the opposite effect. Something like searching for the purpose of one's life was a monumental task. There were many people in existence that would never find this purpose for themselves. And, at this moment, it was unknown whether or not Lionel would be among these individuals. The little mink hopped into Aina's arms, making small, worried purring noises. But, even with the slight commotion, Lionel didn't turn back. He was so engrossed that he probably didn't even notice that Aina had entered to begin with. Aina sighed, not sure of what to do. Her gaze drifted from Lionel's back to the numerous snow globes on the wall. Even now, there were still hundreds. Some were filled with beast carcasses while the others were filled with various herbs. Though Aina didn't recognize much of the herbs, after her ability had evolved with Earth's metamorphosis, she found that she could somewhat read the life signatures of living beings she came across. Aina wondered if this had to do with the life affinity those trial overseers of Valiant Heart Mountain mentioned. But, she wasn't sure. Though she had heard of a blood affinity before, she had never heard of a life elemental affinity. Yet, she had both. Regardless, this ability to read life signatures allowed her to extend her ability. Now, not only did she know the perfect way to train her body to break its limits, she also knew what to consume to help break these limits as well. The extension of this ability also gave her an instinct on how to combine and mix certain materials to benefit herself. Such a breakthrough made Aina realize that if she wanted to maximize this new ability of hers, she would have to spend some time reading many beast and herb compendiums. In the past, the only reading Aina had done was for school. Outside of that, she didn't waste even a moment of time on anything other than training. In fact, although she had wanted to go and watch Lionel's games, she never had because she felt time was simply too precious. But now, this studying would benefit her future, so she no longer had a choice. Lionel said that he never had much of an appetite when he was younger. Aina bit her lip out of habit as she scanned through the snow globes. Lionel never really put two and two together, but the nutrients packed into his father's vomit brew were so numerous that it would have been impossible for him to have any appetite. If anything, he had been overeating his whole life. I wonder how many delicacies he's missed out on. Aina was the opposite. She had always loved food and often ate a lot of it. Lionel had kicked himself for not realizing she needed more food. But the truth was that wasn't his fault. Aina had purposely suppressed her own appetite in the Joan zone subconsciously, maybe because she was worried about how Lionel would react. However now, if she didn't have enough to eat, Lionel would practically stare her down until she did. With his senses, it was difficult for her to fake being full anymore. The memories, albeit from a short time they had been together, brought a smile to Aina's face. She looked back toward Lionel's back, but he had still not reacted to her entrance. After a hint of hesitation, she looked to the snow globes once again, seemingly having come to a decision. I've never cooked before, but Aina's meals had been handled by Yuri for as long as she could remember. She had zero experience cooking, which was also why she always let Lionel handle it. Though Lionel's cooking lacked flair and could only be described as mediocre, it wasn't terrible, so the effort always brought a smile to her face. Aina reached out and began picking out ingredients from the shelf of snow globes, her mind spinning as it came up with several ideas. Though her mind was filled with such thoughts, her heart was focused on something else entirely. All she wanted was to share her love of food with the man she liked. Chapter 588. Lionel's hands were as steady as a rock, his gaze measured and sharp. He seemed to be able to see through everything with a glance, the faint image of a snowy owl hovering to his back. Even after more than a day, Lionel didn't seem to realize the special state he had entered. It was as though he had completely forgotten about the world, as though everything else had been destroyed and all that was left was a man, his metal spirit and his craft. Auspicious air hung around Lionel, its density increasing with every moment. Shockingly enough, Lionel had yet to bother to waste any time on healing himself. His body was just as injured as it had been before his meeting with his grandfather. But, at the same time, it made the process all the more awe-inspiring. Forgetting the world was one matter, but this had reached the level of even forgetting oneself. To be able to move and act as though anyone else in his situation wouldn't be at the brink of death was baffling indeed. However, the truth of the matter was presented for all to see. It had reached a point where even Aina herself simply assumed that Lionel had been healed. After all, there was nothing about his actions that seemed to point toward injury in the slightest. The auspicious air became heavier and heavier, growing to a point a dense, dirty gold hung in the air. It had much of the color of a mustard yellow with a tinge of a noble gold that betrayed its distinctiveness. At an unknown time, the air grew so heavy that cracks began appearing along the lab's setting floors. But, what was maybe most shocking was a certain unmoving snow globe began to show signs of being awakened. Unfortunately, Lionel had yet to realize that the acceleration of Earth's evolution toward the fourth dimension wasn't the only reward for perfectly completing Camelot's trials. With a blank expression, Lionel picked up an intricately carved forearm brace. Little Tolly peeled away from the structure, revealing it in all its glory. It shimmered with a beautiful black-silver color. It was formed in several layers, giving it a sharp appearance. Its presence alone seemed to make space warp and quake. However, despite its beauty, Lionel didn't react much to its appearance at all. He absent-mindedly pressed it into his right forearm. As though by magic, Lionel's body flashed with bronze runes and the bracer sunk into his skin, vanishing as though it was never there. Lionel reached toward his work table again. But, before he could grab anything, he found that there was nothing left to do. His blank expression slowly recovered, a hint of fatigue hiding behind his pupils. At that moment, a wall of thoughts Lionel had done his best to ignore these last few days began to resurface once again. Lionel grasped at his forehead, a light headache taking hold. A deep sigh left his lips. As much as he wanted to lose himself in a world of crafting again, he had used up all his materials. Unless he raided Camelot's vaults again, there wouldn't be anything left to do. And, even if he was that shameless, well, let's just say that King Arthur would probably rip his own hair out if he saw the state of his precious treasure vaults. Lionel didn't quite know how he ended up using so many materials. His original plan didn't require so much. He had wanted to use the others for future crafts he had in mind. When he dug into his memories of what had happened, he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. His previous best craft was only formed of less than a dozen parts. But, this armor was formed of 97. He had thought that he would have to muddle through it for a few weeks, but he had never thought of finishing it all in less than 2 days. Still, rather than feeling proud, he really just wanted something else to throw himself into. Lionel was in a classic state of running away from his problems. Was this what normal teens called procrastinating? It felt worse than just that, though. Lionel had never been one to procrastinate, mostly because he was always good at setting his mind to something and doing it. If not for this, he likely wouldn't have forgotten himself in crafting so easily. My current spear wouldn't pair well with my divine armor. It might be time to change it. If others heard Lionel's thoughts, they would think that he was an ungrateful second-generation nouveau riche. One had to understand the value of a quasi-bronze treasure. Lionel seemed to go through them as though he was drinking water, but such a treasure was the pinnacle of the fourth dimension. Even in the highest fifth-dimensional worlds, a youth like Lionel would scratch and claw for the right to wield such a weapon. Yet, Lionel thought of casually changing his because it simply didn't suit him. Lionel still didn't have a full grasp of the dimensional verse, though, so his face portrayed a very punchable shade of innocence even as he spoke such shameless words. Even if Lionel had known, though, it wouldn't stop him. He immediately sent his mind into spear domain. Not even a quarter-hour later, Lionel came out with a new spear. He only tried to stand with it, yet it nearly sent him crashing down to the ground. Oof. I thought 50 pounds was heavy, but this one is over 5,000. This spear was clearly crafted to be heavy. Its body was over 2.5 meters long and its spear head was a 3-dimensional monstrosity of over 3 feet long alone. Though there was some taper to the spear head to give it the semblance of a blade, it still had a width of over half Lionel's palm. No matter how Lionel looked at it, though it seemed to be a spear, it would be better used as a blunt weapon. With some work, it would definitely be a good hammer. Lionel shook his head. This one is no good too. Lionel entered spear domain again, ignorant to the fact he was becoming a menace to society. Chapter 589. The practically blunt spear had a domain similar to Lionel's chain domain. But, rather than using chains, it caused fluctuations in weight. Depending on how it was used, it could actually be quite useful. But, ultimately, it was just another movement restraining domain that focused on the physical. However, as Lionel began to travel through the spear peaks, he came to realize that this focus on physical restrictions was a running theme amongst the quasi-bronze spears. The next spear Lionel picked up had 2 heads. He stood immersed in the feeling of its domain, grasping it much quicker than he had with his chain domain. In fact, it almost came with too much ease. Lionel had a feeling that this was because of the completion of his spear embryo into true spear force thanks to his comprehension of the complete 4 seasons realm. But, he didn't spend much time thinking about it. This domain, as expected, was another restraining domain. But, this one focused on the wind element. The style of this spear peak in many of the spears that formed its base was swiftness. Controlling the flow of wind in battle could allow one to do a countless number of things. But what Lionel saw as the most potent use would be in controlling momentum. Snatching the tail wind of an opponent and adding it to your own. Under a protracted battle, someone with this domain would be near invincible. The lethality of such a weapon on a battlefield would be undeniable. Still, Lionel felt that this spear wouldn't meld well with his divine armor either. Not to mention the fact he didn't have a wind elemental affinity, this sort of restraining type of battle style wasn't resonating with him at the moment. Somewhere deep inside, he wanted something more destructive, something he could truly release with. However, every spear Lionel came across seemed to tell the same story. A gravity domain. A water domain. A vine domain. Lionel walked through the spear domain as though it was his own backyard. He had completely forgotten that even taking a single step in this world used to deplete him down to his very core. Now, he traveled from peak to peak, not finding anything he could use. By now, Lionel had conquered over a dozen quasi-bronze peaks, but he hadn't found anything he wanted. The truth was that the number of such treasures in spear domain was practically endless. Even after hours of walking, even to the point of ignoring all the foundational spears, Lionel still hadn't come anywhere near the end of them. Lionel believed that there were easily tens of thousands of quasi-bronze peaks. Let alone quasi-bronze peaks, there were probably just as many quasi-silver peak and beyond as well. This treasure seemed to treat such spears as though they were a dime a dozen. And in fact, they were, at least here, anyway. It was no wonder Lionel took them for granted. Quasi-silver. Lionel looked up toward the distance. He had grasped a quasi-bronze spear before his soul force was even in the third dimension. Now that he was at the peak of the fourth dimension with his soul force, why not try for a fifth-dimensional weapon? Lionel stepped forward, crossing through the rolling hills with slow steps. The graveyard of spears around him seemed to get particularly silent at this moment. Maybe even the creator of spear domain couldn't have imagined a day where someone within the third dimension would have the gall to stroll through their world in such a way. However, compared to the past, it couldn't be said that Lionel was still unqualified. One had to remember that strength of mind was only one aspect of traveling through spear domain. The most important factor was most definitely one's comprehension of the spear. The first time Lionel had come here, he had barely formed spear force. The fact he could take a single step at all was a testament to how strong his mind was. But now, Lionel had fully grasped the four-season realm. Though this wasn't perfectly tailored to the spear, it could be said that the spear, and every other weapon, was perfectly tailored to it. The combination of this comprehension and Lionel's strong mind made the journey forward surprisingly easy. Even when it began to grow difficult, a sharp spear force appeared around Lionel, slicing through the presence of the spears around him. The clashing of blades sung in the air, but Lionel's steps didn't pause. By now, the spears around him had completely morphed. From wooden and half-broken, they began to sing with their own sort of majesty. In fact, they quickly rose from the lower black levels, jumping to Tier 5, through Tier 6 and past Tier 7. By the time Lionel got to the range of the quasi-silver peaks, there were nothing but bronze-grade spears around, each radiating a palpable aura even beyond that of his chain spear. This is the true fifth dimension. Lionel thought about where he had sensed this before, only for his mind to flash to thoughts of a massive flying ship ripping through the barrier of Earth's fold of reality. So that's where. He was in the fifth dimension, but suppressed. Lionel shook his head, still not wanting to think of such things. He basked in the aura of these spears, still not realizing the kind of treasure trove that was before him. As far as Lionel was concerned, after completing his divine armor, he now had the skills to begin crafting bronze treasures. All he needed was the material to do so. However, even for him, a quasi-silver treasure was leagues away. He neither had the strength necessary to claim one from a zone, nor the skill necessary to craft one. In Lionel's eye, all he could see was a single silver light, standing tall atop a spear peak. But, unlike the rolling hills of the quasi-bronze peaks, this one looked like a small mountain, stretching over 100 meters tall. Lionel's gaze glowed. He had finally found something else he could throw himself into. Chapter 590. Lionel appeared in the lab setting, his chest heaving. He sent a gaze toward the silver spear in his hand, shaking his head at how crazy he was. He felt like he could have really died climbing that mountain. The presence of this spear made him feel suffocated, let alone the fact its polearm alone was over 3 meters long. It could only be described as a monstrous weapon. Even now, it was shining too brightly for Lionel to get a good look at it. Lionel squinted, but all he could barely make out was the fact this spear was also double-sided, similar to the wind domain quasi-bronze spear he had run into previously. In addition, this spear seemed to be able to split into 3 portions connected by chains. Of course, Lionel couldn't see any of this very clearly. He had only gotten a faint vision of the spear when he first touched it. Outside of that, he had nothing else to pull from. Lionel could feel that the spear was struggling against his grasp as though it had a mind of its own. Clearly, it felt like Lionel wasn't worthy of it. In truth, Lionel couldn't blame it. The normal way to use spear domain would be to slowly master the spears that surrounded the base of the spear peak. The comprehension of these spears would give one the insight necessary to comprehend the domain of the spear at the peak. Only then would one then gain the acknowledgement of the spear in question. But Lionel had bulldozed his way to the top, relying on a combination of his mental strength and his 4 seasons realm. He really had no business wielding such a spear. Beyond this, there seemed to be a qualitative change in weapons after the bronze grade as well. While Lionel's 4th-dimensional weapons were only good for their quality and sharpness, effectively, this spear seemed to be able to effect change in the surroundings. Some of the force arts that formed its foundation seemed to flash into existence from time to time, making their displeasure known. "Shut up," Lionel said faintly, cursing the spear as he fell into a deep sleep. "You idiot. Sleeping on the floor. What were you thinking?" Lionel could vaguely sense his body being hauled out of the lab setting. Before he knew it, he was being thrown into a pool of water. He shot up in confusion, his fatigue vanishing into a feeling of surprise. However, by the time he had shot to the top of the pool, the culprit had already vanished. Lionel wiped his face, sliding his hair back from his eyes. In the end, he chuckled and shook his head. How long had he slept? A few days probably. It was no wonder Aina just tossed him into the water like this. Spear? Lionel blinked, looking around him to find that his spear was nowhere to be seen. He sent his sight into spear domain, only to find the spear back on the spear peak. Lionel shook his head, but he didn't mind too much. Whenever he entered spear domain, he would reappear where he had been last. So, at the very least, he didn't need to climb that mountain again. He could just snatch the spear whenever he wanted. If it's double-sided, could it still be called a spear? Lionel shook his head, it didn't matter much. During his time in spear domain, he had seen many weapons that he'd have a hard time classifying as a spear. But, he found no real point in thinking about it too much. After he cleaned himself, Lionel walked out of the bathhouse to suddenly catch a whiff of something. His tongue involuntarily watered, his steps quickening. He had hardly been to the place he was headed in. Though he knew the abode setting had everything a normal house would, the kitchen simply wasn't a place he frequented. But this was the first time Lionel could remember smelling food that made him feel as though he was floating on air. Of course, Lionel had smelt good food before. It was just that he never had the appetite to match, so it never really hit him like it did now. And, even after his appetite had returned in full force, well, 90% of Earth was nothing but collapsed buildings and vast ocean now. So, where would he have a chance to smell such delicacies? Lionel rounded a corner and appeared within a luxurious kitchen. If a chef could see this place, they would definitely curse Lionel for wasting such treasures. But, it truly wasn't his fault. Much of the things in this place, Lionel had no idea how to use. It was all a mixture of extremely high-tech and ancient cooking devices that left his head spinning. On one corner of the room, there was an oven that looked more like a planetary destruction weapon, but on the other side, there was a stone oven that looked like a place one might have cooked pizza with 500 years ago. Of course, what Lionel didn't know was that with every upgrade of the segmented cube, not only did the cleansing waters improve, but so did the gardens and the kitchen as well. The devices in this place could burn even a beast on the verge of entering the fifth dimension to a crisp. In fact, with some creativity and patience, it could even cook true fifth-dimensional beings as well. This might not sound like a big deal, but if one thought of the dimensions properly, it was like giving mortals the power to cook gods. It was insane that Lionel hadn't seen this place's value before. Of course, in the middle of this large kitchen, there was a petite young lady wearing her hair up in a bun. Beads of sweat fell down her face as she bit her lip, her expression the picture of absolute focus. Lionel seemed to get lost in her efforts. As hard as he had worked to forget things these past few days, just this seemed enough to make him ignore the rest of the world even if it was collapsing around him. Seemingly sensing something, Aina turned toward Lionel with a bright smile on her face as she wiped her brow, the high temperatures of the stove she was working over causing wisps of water vapor to rise from her skin. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. Chapter 591. Lionel should have been taking in what the rest of the room had to offer, but truthfully, he couldn't take his eyes off of Aina. Everything from the beads of sweat falling down her face to the apron clinging to her curves made his heart stop. Aina's smile faded into one of confusion. What's wrong? For a moment, Aina became worried. In truth, she had taken Lionel's things without asking and even started using the kitchenwares and appliances too. Though Lionel had said to treat this place like her home, had she maybe gotten a little too comfortable? She blushed in embarrassment, trying to figure out how she should apologize. Though Lionel never spoke about his parents, Aina had gained a few tidbits here and there, definitely enough to know that this place was left behind by his father. After all, she had been there when Lionel first got the segmented cube. For all she knew, this place was very important to Lionel, but now whatever sentimental value it might have had was washed away by her cooking. But, before she could form the words of apology, she found a large shadow enveloping her. Lionel hugged Aina tightly, seemingly not feeling much from the heat around them at all. At his current level, it might as well have been a slight breeze tickling his skin and nothing more. Aina was stunned for a moment. But when she realized what was happening, she panicked. You're going to burn yourself. Lionel pulled back and grinned, his smile beaming. Clearly, though, he didn't take Aina's warning very seriously. In truth, even Lionel didn't quite know why he was so excited. There was just something about the current situation that felt right. Of course, if he said this aloud, Aina would probably beat him to death. He might as well have put his foot in his mouth saying that she belonged in the kitchen. Still, even though he chose to keep these words to himself, he still beamed beside himself, unable to stop himself from feeling happy for the first time in several days. Lionel looked around, only to find a large steel table filled with delicacies. Each had a small cut in them, making it obvious that someone diligent had gone through and tasted each and every one. You did all this? Lionel asked. Seeing that Lionel wasn't mad at her, Aina's smile returned. But, before she could answer, a hint of panic colored her features. She had almost forgotten something important. Aina ignored Lionel's question, dashing to the stove and flipping a pan. What looked like an elaborate omelette, expelling a rich fragrance, flipped in the air to reveal a golden brown base that seemed crisp just to sight alone. Aina breathed a sigh of relief before rushing out of the kitchen, pan in hand. Lionel blinked in confusion before hurrying after her. But, what he found at the end of her run was something that left him even more stunned than the kitchen had. Unlike the kitchen, Lionel had been here several times. In fact, he frequented this place. However, he had never seen it look like this. The dining room of the abode setting was large enough to comfortably feed a family of 8. But, at the moment, every stretch of table was completely covered with a plate or plates of food. Aina stood on her tippy toes, carefully sliding the omelette onto a layered dish as though crowning her final achievement. Aina wiped her brow with a forearm again before smiling lightly. It was only at that moment that Lionel understood that all the dishes that took up the steel table were nothing but experiments. Lionel's heart couldn't help but warm. He had no idea how much effort Aina had put into trying different combinations of beast meat and herbs to eventually come up with all of this, but he was quite frankly left stunned. "What are you just standing there for?" Aina looked toward Lionel. "Eat." And so Lionel did. He hardly remembered the first bite, but he most definitely lamented the last. He had thought that maybe like those comedic animes his dad always made him watch, he'd have to pretend to love Aina's food to make her feel better. But the reality was completely outside his expectations. Not only did the food look and smell good, it was so delicious that Lionel felt as though he was ascending to another realm. And, in fact, in a way, he was. It was even to the point where even the injuries he hadn't bothered to heal to this point, as though a badge to remind him of something, had begun to heal on their own. Aina watched on with a smile on her face, her elbows on the table and her hands cupping her face. Though she too had a great appetite, after all the taste tests she had done over the last few days, she was as full as could be at the moment. If Lionel knew this, he would probably be even more stunned. With all the tiny bites he had seen before. Just how many test dishes would she have to have made in order to be full? However, Lionel was so engrossed in eating that he didn't even realize that Aina didn't have anything for herself. It was only after he had his last bite that he looked up at her as though he was looking at a monster. Lionel's gaze locked onto Aina, seemingly not wanting to waste time looking at anything else. Aina blinked. "I'm not part of the feast, you know." Lionel was stunned out of his shock into a fit of laughter when he heard these words. "And why not?" He grinned slyly. Aina shook her head and mumbled under her breath. "Men. Maybe Savon was right, you lot can never be satisfied." Lionel coughed and held his chest. Another fatal blow. Aina giggled, seemingly pleased by Lionel's reaction. But after a while, her expression grew to one of worry, scanning Lionel. "Are you all right?" Chapter 592. Lionel sighed hearing Aina's question. Quite frankly, he didn't know how to respond. Was he all right? Well, technically, there wasn't anything wrong with him. His life wasn't in danger, his future wasn't exactly bleak. Truthfully, he didn't have very much to worry about at all. Of course, if the members of Shield Cross Stars heard these thoughts of his, it would be hard to tell how they would react. After all, no one had ever had such a nonchalant response to being designated a Tier 3 criminal. To put matters into perspective, to even be labeled a Tier 9 criminal was enough to have bounty hunters breathing down your neck. To leap from a Tier 4 criminal to a Tier 3 was the equivalent of being a felon that could be sentenced to consecutive life sentences. Lionel was quite literally only short of individuals known for destroying worlds, solar systems, and galaxies. This was how serious this matter was. Yet, Lionel hardly spared a thought toward this matter. In fact, ever since his conversation with his grandfather, it was all that had been on his mind. He couldn't find a reason to care about anything else. If it wasn't for the fact that Lionel had already sworn to himself to find a cure for Aina, he might have had no other purpose but to lounge around in depression at the moment. Maybe the harshest truth of it all was that Lionel didn't feel that this matter was even as serious as that. Depression was often something a person couldn't control, an imbalance in the chemicals of the mind that caused up and down swings in mood. Lionel couldn't say he was going through such a thing, but what he did know was that he felt everything that had once been in his control was slowly but surely slipping away. Lionel sighed again. "I just don't feel like I have as much of a grasp on things as I once did. I find it laughable that I thought I understood anything to begin with." Aina gazed toward Lionel, unsure of how she should answer. She didn't feel as strongly about certain things as Lionel did. The deaths of the common folk of Earth? She didn't spare them a thought. There were some things about this cruel world that she was just numb to. If it wasn't for the fact it was someone she cared about feeling this way, even to this point she might not have spared a thought toward those matters. However, at the same time, she didn't want Lionel to keep running from his own thoughts. She was herself while he was him. They would never be the same. While she found it easy to ignore such things, Lionel wasn't the same. That said, Aina felt that there was something off about how much Lionel cared, almost as though he was trying to cling to ideals that weren't his own while he ran from an even larger problem. Unfortunately, maybe the one things Lionel had never told Aina was about his conversation with Coach Owen and the truth surrounding his birth. Whether by coincidence and subconsciously, or on purpose and consciously, she didn't have the final piece of the puzzle that she needed. Did you always know how to cook this well? Lionel shook his head, quickly changing the subject. Aina realized what he was doing, but there were some things that couldn't be pressed. If Lionel didn't want to talk about it, forcing him to do so would only make him shut down. No, Aina replied with a smile. Usually it was Yuri who always took care of the cooking. I was bored, so I thought I would try my hand at it. Aina waved off her efforts with a hand. But Lionel's silent smile seemed to see right through her. I think it's more than just that, Lionel said after Aina began squirming in her seat beneath his gaze. There was something special about your cooking, as though it had its own unique flow of energy. It was definitely beyond anything I've ever eaten before. Aina couldn't help but smile at such praise. Just that sentence alone seemed to make all her efforts worthwhile. I'm not sure. I only relied on my ability to tell me what combinations would work well. In the end, this was the product. Your ability evolved? Aina nodded. Beyond self-healing and my training intuition, I can tell what resources I need to consume to improve myself. Lionel's gaze glowed. Even without knowing much about the dimensional verse, Lionel felt that this ability would most definitely be exceptionally rare. If just a few days of experimentation allowed Aina's cooking to have such effects, what if she put in more effort than that? Have you ever thought about becoming a force pill refiner? Lionel suddenly asked. Force pill refiner. Aina was stunned. They were called a lot of things. Force pill refiners, alchemists, potionsmiths, elixir crafters. In truth, their products didn't always come in the form of pills. Sometimes it was elixirs and potions, sometimes it was ointments and topical creams, and yet other times it could come in the form of brews or food. Though they came in many different variations, their core principles were similar enough to be lumped into a single group. But, much like languages across worlds, they often had different methods of communication to accomplish the same goals. This was why Lionel was so certain that if Aina could do this, translating her ability to create pills, elixirs, or ointments wouldn't be too large of a leap. Even if she only wanted to focus on food, it wouldn't be a major loss, albeit a waste of her talent. Aina smiled. You know about such things? Lionel almost blushed if it wasn't for the fact his skin was so thick. Aina wasn't wrong. Usually, it was her teaching him about things like this. He was about as ignorant as it came when it was in regards to matters of the dimensional verse. It could be said that the only reason Lionel knew about this profession at all was due to the introductory crafting lessons his father had given him. But you're right. Aina continued after teasing Lionel. I think that learning more systematically rather than relying on my talent will help me improve faster. In Aina's mind, all that mattered was if she could grow stronger. Becoming a force pill crafter was definitely one such method. It would definitely help her self-training reach a completely new level. Just as Lionel was about to respond, his ring began to vibrate. Huh. Valiant Heart Mountain. So soon. Chapter 593. Lionel and Aina's gaze met, both clearly able to see the other's surprise. However, after a moment, they found it easier to accept. When Lionel spoke with Sale, the overseer of the Brave City trial at the time, he learned that Valiant Heart Mountain would be teleporting all its candidates at once in order to save on costs. Though Lionel didn't think much of it at the time, it was clear that Valiant Heart Mountain wasn't in the best of positions at the moment if they were penny pinching to that extent. But Lionel didn't care much. He already had a great distrust of organizations. The only reason he was going was because of Aina. At least this way, he could make sure she wouldn't have to deal with any injustices. Of course, Lionel also had no idea that Sale had already reported him to the higher-ups of Valiant Heart Mountain, causing a fissure to appear in upper management. The details of this matter, though, would be left unknown to Lionel for a long while. But it seemed that those of Valiant Heart Mountain saw this as an opportunity as well, not having any idea that the supposed Morales clan heir they were banking their futures on was completely ignorant to his status. I guess we should prepare. Lionel finally spoke. Aina nodded. I'm going to go change. Aina stood up and hesitated, seeing all the dishes that lay empty. She couldn't just leave them here. Lionel grinned. Let me watch you change and I'll wash the dishes. Aina blushed furiously, glaring at Lionel. Pervert. Lionel laughed as Aina ran away, picking up the dishes that were left. Is there a dishwasher? Lionel asked the dictionary, hoping for the best. Luckily, he wasn't disappointed. After rinsing the dishes a bit and stuffing the machine full, Lionel turned his attention to his own clothing change. Stripping off the tatters that remained of his clothing, he slipped on the white hammer pants given to him by Sale and tightly wrapped the cloth belt around his waist. Lionel couldn't help but grin. He felt like he was Aladdin, so where was his genie? Shaking his head to get rid of his childish thoughts, Lionel adjusted the cloth belt so that its end dangled between his legs, revealing the hidden ancient patterns. Finally, he pulled out the Egyptian-like neckwear. Heavy. Lionel thought as he had the almost solid piece of black steel in his hand. The neck piece alone was at least 50 pounds, it had quite the heft to it. Aina walked in to find Lionel changing in the kitchen. Toward such a scene, she really didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Didn't he have his own bedroom? What was he doing? Then again, now that she thought about it, Lionel's room had become the place the two of them slept in. So, maybe it couldn't really be considered his room anymore. Aina blushed slightly, but quickly shook her head to tease Lionel for his ridiculous choice of location. Unfortunately, before she could, Lionel stood his full height, his back view enveloping her vision. His tan skin seemed to emit a slight sheen of bronze. The definition of his back and the way it flexed slightly with his every movement made Aina flash back to moments when her hands ran across those deep trenches. It was the kind of back she could rely on, the kind she had laid upon as Lionel stomped out her worst fears. Aina blushed from something other than embarrassment, turning her head away and pretending as though she hadn't seen anything. Why did Valiant Heart Mountain have such a provocative dress code? What Aina didn't know was that as she looked away, Lionel sensed her presence and looked back only to have the same exact thought she had had. The only difference between the male uniform and the female uniform was a second cloth band that wrapped around the chest. But this one was white to match the pants rather than being the same black as the cloth belt. However, this only served to leave Lionel short of breath. He had understood ever since that day in the bathhouse why Aina also wore that loose-fitting military garb. But, seeing her wear such a thing practically stopped his heart. The way her pants clung to her hips, the subtle but feminine definition of her abs after every breath, the way her chest cloth elegantly curved to display those two delicacies that Lionel could still faintly feel on his palms. Lionel had seen his fair share of women who were even more scantily clad than this. But only Aina could make his heart flutter. Aina jumped, but she couldn't run away before Lionel's hands were already on her hips. The blush on her face had still yet to vanish, making her all the more alluring. Wait. The teleportation is. Lionel's lips sealed her own. Aina's eyes widened, but after a moment, she seemed to fall victim to Lionel's advances. Her hands found their way to that very back she was dreaming of tracing, her eyes closing as she lost herself in another world. Lionel pulled back, grinning. Aina's eyes slowly opened, only to feel as though a devil was smiling down at her. Aina looked away, trying to avoid his gaze. But what she saw in her surroundings made her want to dive back into his arms before finding a hole to crawl into. What should have been the segmented cube's kitchen had suddenly become the midway point of a mountain larger than anything Aina had ever seen. At the mountain pass, there were two pillars, each over 100 meters tall and inscribed with the images of war and roaring beasts. Their presence alone, despite being so far away, made the gates of Brave City seem like nothing more than child's play. However, what had Aina wanting to hide away wasn't the mountain, nor the pillars, nor even the floating islands in the distance. It was the fact that there were suddenly thousands of youths around them, each at this very same mountain pass. Lionel laughed at Aina's flustered reaction. Isn't this what she gets for teasing him all the time? He finally got a bit of revenge. Ah, it tasted sweet. Now that he thought about it, she tasted quite sweet too. He almost wanted another taste. However, his good mood didn't last very long. If I had a face like that, I'd be looking for a place to hide too. Chapter 594. Lionel's expression darkened. Aina's own, which had just been filled with embarrassment, almost instantly became as still as a lake. If it wasn't for the fact that she had just been so animated, one would think that she was nothing more than a statue, a puppet that was completely unaffected by the outside world. A cold wind swept through the grounds. In truth, not many were paying attention to the situation. Though Aina and Lionel had just appeared out of seemingly thin air, so had everyone else who had come to this place. In fact, even to this very moment, there were still more youths popping up, looking wide-eyed toward the massive pillars on either side of the mountain pass. With this concentration of people, there were no doubt several conversations happening at once, especially since those from similar worlds had been teleported to the same spots much like Lionel and Aina. This was all to say that this singular sentence hardly traveled a few meters before getting lost in the hustle and bustle of the excited youths around them. In fact, it was very likely that the person who spoke these words didn't even mean for Lionel and Aina to hear them in the first place. They were just mocking and jeering from within their friend group. Yet, at that moment, Lionel's gaze turned toward the voice, easily able to pinpoint it amidst the sea of noise. The young woman who had spoken was dressed in an attire identical to Aina, as were all the women accepted into Valiant Heart Mountain. Though, there seemed to be a very poor ratio of men to women in this place. There were at least 5 or 6 males to every 1 female. Unlike Aina, though, this young woman seemed to lean into her sexuality. Her cloth belt was extremely loose, allowing her pants to just barely hang from her hips. At the same time, whereas Aina's cloth wrap was large enough to even cover a portion of her belly, this woman seemed to have chosen to fold her own as narrowly as possible, causing 2 round protrusions to be just barely visible from the bottom. It was most definitely this heavenly flavor of underboob that had caused males even from other worlds to flock around her like a den of wolves. Even those males who weren't as confident in their strength observed her from a distance, trying to sneak a few more peeks in as they bet on how many rounds of battle she could last without exposing a little nipple. Lionel's gaze made the young lady accidentally bite her tongue, her pupils trembling slightly. As expected, she really hadn't thought that Lionel would hear her. But, seeing his reaction made her feel as though her head had been dunked into a vat of ice. When she saw that Lionel was a man, though, she seemed to shake herself awake. Maybe she would have been scared if Aina was the one exuding this kind of pressure, but what male would deem to harm her? Maybe his world is filled with ugly women or something. To be so handsome yet pick out such a tramp, is he blind? The young woman stuck her chest out more prominently as though to provoke Lionel into dropping his seething rage. Originally, the young lady had only commented offhandedly, not planning on confronting Aina personally. After all, she wasn't a fool, she had no idea the kind of background these people had, nor did she understand anything about their tempers. Plus, on top of that, she was a genius in her own right, she wouldn't be so bored as to go out of her way to bully someone without cause. But now that her off-handed joke had been accidentally heard, she also had no intention of backing down. This was Valiant Heart Mountain, a place where the strong thrived and the weak got eaten. If she showed weakness now, her future was practically finished. However, the glaze-over effect her ample breasts and outrageous curves usually had seemed to fall completely flat in the face of Lionel. With a step forward, Lionel's minor action seemed to cause the ground to quake. In an instant, what was a situation hardly anyone paid attention to had suddenly become the center of focus. The young lad's expression changed, not expecting Lionel to suddenly react like this. Before she could think of how to react, though, several men stepped forward to block Lionel's path just as Aina grabbed onto Lionel's forearm. Lionel frowned and looked back. "You cause trouble everywhere you go," Aina said lightly. "Just leave it alone, it's not a big deal." Lionel's brow furrowed. Aina's lip curled. "What? You suddenly gain a little bit of strength and think it's okay to hit women now? Should I fear for myself? Maybe I should just forget about us." By the end of her words, Aina looked as though she was on the verge of tears. Ah. Lionel didn't know what to say. Sure, he had learned throughout his youth to never put hands on a woman, but that was back when their strength couldn't be compared to a man's. In this new world order, even this petite Aina's physical strength was greater than his own. Lionel was a very logical person, so the moment the foundation for his protective spirit toward women was no longer there, he likewise had no qualms about hitting and even killing them. In fact, he had already done so with a fair few from Joan all the way to Pisces. Where was the justice? How was he getting bullied for trying to defend his own woman? Lionel shook his head. "You win. You win. Don't cry." Lionel's switch from murder machine to simping boyfriend was so abrupt that hardly anyone knew how to react. However, no one felt it more acutely than the young lady herself, who suddenly had a massive weight taken off her shoulders. If it wasn't for support she got from another rare female and friend, she would have collapsed. When she looked back up, her gaze was filled with resentment as she gazed toward Lionel's back. She clenched her fists, her eyes practically spewing fire. Seeing such a scene, the men who had gathered to protect her didn't seem intent on backing off after being instigated by Lionel. Chapter 595. Lionel held his hands together while appeasing Aina, an ingratiating smile on his face. He didn't even spare the group behind him a glance. Or, maybe, he was truly entirely focused on Aina to begin with. Aina smiled slyly, seemingly enjoying Lionel's display. Wasn't this what he got for teasing her like that? Kissing her in front of so many people, what a bad guy. "All right, I'll forgive you this one time." Lionel beamed as Aina flipped a palm to reveal her blue-veined mask. She slipped it on, feeling more at ease now that the itchiness of her face was dying down. She had taken the mask off previously because she was worried about it being harmed in the kitchen. But the truth was that Lionel's crafts weren't so fragile. After all, he had designed it to have great defensive prowess. But the care she took for the gift spoke volumes about how much she appreciated it. Of course, those who had been paying attention had no idea that Aina was putting on her mask simply to alleviate the discomfort of her curse. To them, she had been ashamed by the young lad's previous words and had now chosen to hide her face. Such a scene provoked the sneers of the men who had been trying to prove themselves to the young lady. To get angry at such a beauty for a woman that looked like that. Had someone kicked this guy in the head when he was younger? Clearly, they were dissatisfied with how Lionel was ignoring them and even turning their back to them. But they still felt that it was no longer appropriate to lash out. Still, they marked down Lionel in their minds. The moment they learned of his background, as long as he didn't have the capital to wield such arrogance, they would let him know the consequences of trying to impress women. Obviously, they hadn't sensed the irony of their own thoughts. "Miss Balthorn, are you all right?" The young lady who had helped Balthorn withstand Lionel's gaze and helped her up spoke. Despite having been admitted into the same organization, the young lady still didn't dare to be disrespectful to Balthorn. In fact, when she had made that comment about Ailsa, the young lady had even politely laughed along with the rest. The men sheathed their weapons and surrounded Balthorn as well, trying to radiate outward with a manly presence. They were all aware that Balthorn's background wasn't small. In fact, her family was a preeminent powerhouse of their quadrant. Amongst those who had come, she was most definitely amongst the most well taken care of. She was Balthorn Valinor, the young mistress of the Valinor family. The Valinor family was among the 3 most powerful on planet Krars, a world on the brink of entering the 5th dimension and with the potential of a 6th-dimensional world. If Lionel had heard this, he would have faintly recognized the name. In fact, among the prisoners he had taken from White City, there was a man who claimed to be from planet Krars X10, a subsidiary of Krars. Back then, Aina had told Lionel that Krars was among the most powerful worlds of their quadrants. As for how large a quadrant was, Lionel had no idea. He only assumed that it was at least a few solar systems worth of space. But it was much vaster than this. Every galaxy would have at most a few hundred quadrants. Though this seemed like a large number, if one considered the enormous size of a galaxy, if a quadrant could be worth a single percentage of its size, it would be grandiose beyond imagining. At the very least, if Lionel's ancestors of the 21st century tried to cross such a distance, even their entire lifetimes wouldn't be enough. In fact, even 100 generations wouldn't be enough either. For Krars to be among the dominant forces of a quadrant, there was no doubting its strength. That said, for Balthorn to be sent to Valiant Heart Mountain, an organization that was facing such struggles, it was clear that she wasn't very important to her family. Still, compared to the background of these young men, she was light years ahead. If they could gain her favor and become her husband, they'd feel as though they had lived a fulfilled life. Fine. Balthorn said somewhat weakly, her heart still beating erratically. There's no need to worry about that coward, Balthorn. I just checked, but that weakling is still in the third dimension. There's no threat from him, I could kill him as easily as slaughtering a chicken. Balthorn's eyes flashed when she heard these words. Third dimension. You idiot. That only means he's even more talented than you. Do you think Valiant Heart Mountain has fallen far enough to let people in just because? If that was the case, why would I bother with coming here? Balthorn bit her lip, suddenly feeling annoyed by all the flies buzzing around her. Seeing Lionel's attention completely focused on Aina, she bit her lip harder. The dichotomy between the kind of love the two women were receiving was striking to the point of being stifling. The young lady by Balthorn's side, Henoran, gazed between the former and Aina but in the end remained silent. In the distance, a young man watched all of this just as silently. Compared to the youths brimming with vitality around him, he seemed to have already placed a foot in his coffin. He was skinny to the point the line of his spine and his ribs were sinking against his skin. His complexion was pale to the point of being deathly. And his back curved somewhat as though his head was too heavy to carry. He gazed toward Lionel for a moment before shifting back toward Balthorn. His tongue ran over his lips as he stared her up and down, his eyes focusing on her chest for an obscene amount of time. But, what was maybe more grating was the fact his tongue, rather than being a healthy pink, was a dull gray. At that moment, the tall pillars of the mountain pass quaked and a portal opened within them to reveal several figures. It seemed the big shots of Valiant Heart Mountain had finally appeared. Chapter 596. Compared to the dress of the youths, the elders of Valiant Heart Mountain weren't dressed much differently at all. In fact, there were only two differences one could point out. The first was the color of their cloth belts. What dangled between their legs wasn't the black of the youths, but rather a striking red. At least, most of them wore this red as though dyed by centuries of blood. The old man that led them, though, wore one of copper, as though the blood that had once drenched his had rusted over with age. The second difference was a shawl draped over their shoulders. This matched the color of their cloth belts, giving them a more dignified appearance than the kids below. The old man's exposed torso was just as hollowed out as the pale young man from before. But, though his body seemed worn with age, his back was as straight as a javelin despite the fact he simultaneously used a walking stick. The atmosphere fell into silence as this group of five walked forward. One could feel the difference between realms of existence when standing before the powerful. Though these five elders had yet to speak a word, it felt as though there was a mountain weighing down on them all, as though they wouldn't be satisfied until they all kneeled in deference. Though the dimensions felt like power levels, this wasn't the case. In fact, only talents like Lionel and Aina would feel this way. Like crossing dimensions and evolving to a higher state of being was no different than crossing any other barrier. However, to middling existences, the barrier between dimensions was akin to heaven and earth. There was no doubt that each and every one of these elders stood as a fifth-dimensional entity, a barrier that more than half of those here would never even cross, let alone travel so deeply into. This was a strength that they idealized, that they aspired to, that they respected from the deepest recesses of their hearts. Stop playing around. Lionel felt a strong elbow to his side and coughed lightly. He looked up to see what all the commotion was about, only to find that no one dared to even breathe too harshly. When he saw the elders at the very front, he raised his brows. Lionel felt like a refreshing breeze was wrapping around his body. Unfortunately, he couldn't enjoy it very much because he seemingly only now remembered that he was still injured. Though Aina's food had helped him along, he was still only about 70% of his normal self, which was a miracle unto itself considering the state of his inner organs previously. Now that Lionel thought about it, Aina's food was definitely not enough for such a drastic improvement. Was he missing something? Oh, Lionel suddenly remembered the odd state he had entered when he was completing his divine armor. Back then, he had vaguely felt an energy integrating with his body and improving it. If it wasn't for the fact he hadn't been swallowing any metal essence at that moment, his metal body might have already improved to tier 3 or 4 by now. It was only now that Lionel understood that that feeling must have come from the energy he absorbed from the puppet master. Due to how powerful Lionel had become, he had almost forgotten that defeating invalids could improve his strength. But this wasn't really his fault. He was so powerful, but Earth only had third-dimensional invalids to deal with. Those existences could barely move the needle for him. Yet, he had gone from third-dimensional invalids to a variant invalid on the verge of entering the fifth dimension. The difference was striking. It was no wonder the puppet master's residual energy had such a great benefit to him. In fact, now that he was paying attention, Lionel could tell that he had only absorbed about 20 or 30% of the energy. Unfortunately, his body was too injured to absorb any more or improve any further. It seemed he would have to focus on healing. By now, his healing branch ability could allow him to heal back to a perfect state immediately. But it seemed a waste to use in this situation considering how long it took to recharge. Forget it, I'll be patient for now. The elders scanned the crowd in silence, allowing the youths to soak up the feeling of being in their presence. This wasn't just for the sake of showing off their might, it was also to give them a goal to aspire to while also making their authority unquestionable. Every organization was built from the bottom up. The more obedient and simultaneously ambitious their fresh blood was, the better. But, in this crowd of serious youths, the one individual with an absent-minded gaze couldn't help but stand out. It also most definitely didn't help that there was a small clearing around this person and also that this person was far taller than most on average. Several gazes landed on Lionel. The change should have been enough to shock him awake, but Lionel continued to be lost in his own world as though his daydreaming was far more important than anything happening here. Of course, he wasn't doing this on purpose. What these else thought should have been obvious pressure was like a spring breeze to Lionel. If it wasn't for Aina pinching his waist and startling him, he probably wouldn't notice at all. Seeing the gazes of the elders, Lionel smiled lightly and stood at attention, respectfully keeping his hands to his sides. There was truly nothing about his actions that the elders could pick out. But, their lips couldn't help but twitch regardless. The old man at the front swept his gaze over Lionel one more time before he began to speak. Do you all see these pillars to my back? The shuffling of necks resounded through the mountain pass as they all looked upward. These pillars are the foundation of Valiant Heart Mountain. You all might not understand now, but this is our home, our lifeblood, our heart. You all may think that since you have made it here, you can be considered members of our Valiant Heart Mountain. However, to me, unless you can walk through these gates on your own, you will never be. Even if you die before my eyes, I'll never raise a finger to help you. Luckily for you brats, my methods were deemed too cruel. So you have 3 years to walk through these gates on your own 2 feet. That said, even if I don't have my way, I also have no intention of letting you all go so easily. Below this mountain pass, there are numerous beasts. Some of them are tagged while some of them are not. These tags carry the teleportation talismans you need to enter the mountain peak without crossing these gates. There are 3,802 of you here. There are exactly 1901 tagged beasts. Among these tags, there are 10 golden tags that will allow you one trip to the Valiant Vault. You have 12 hours. The wind around the youths suddenly stilled to a crawl. Chapter 597. The atmosphere froze for just a moment before the youths suddenly erupted into movement. What once was an orderly field of promising geniuses became akin to a mosh pit. But, in this context, with the strength of the people in question, it felt as though this mountain that Valiant Heart had called home for so long might collapse. Earth cracked, air crackled, the sounds of shouts of anger and pain sounded as the so-called geniuses fought and jostled for position, each trying to make their way down the mountain faster than the last. In what felt like no more than half a minute, over 90% of the field had been completely dispersed. As for those that remained, they had long since been trampled by the crowd to the point of being on their last breaths. There was no doubt that amidst all the chaos, some had taken advantage of the situation to get rid of some competition. However, true to his word, the old man didn't raise a single finger, watching these youths with broken bodies bleed out without a single word. Aside from a sweep of his gaze, he spared them nothing more, even as some of them begged and pleaded. Still, there were a few that seemed to stand out, geniuses who had kept their calm even in the face of such harsh elimination requirements. There was the pale youth who was, even now, still intently staring at Balthorn. There was a burly young man with twin short sabers strapped to his back, juxtaposed to his size. They felt more like curved daggers than saber-like weapons. There was a young woman whose hair was pulled into 2 ponytails that combined down her chest. And, finally, there was Balthorn herself. Each stared at the gates intently, unwilling to take their eyes off of it. Of course. With the exception of the pale youth. Among these youths were Lionel and Aina, who hadn't moved from the very beginning. But, rather than having done so out of curiosity, their reasoning was far different from the norm. Rather, Lionel had begun teasing Aina before she could even think of the next step she wanted to take. But, after a while, Lionel raised his head to take a look at all the carnage. With furrowed brows, he raised a hand. Grand heel. Strong light elemental force descended from the skies, falling onto the bodies of the youths who lay bleeding out on the ground. If they were really left for just a few more minutes, it was likely that of them would survive. This minor action caused Lionel to once again become the center of attention. The old man raised an eyebrow, but he couldn't exactly become mad at Lionel's actions. After all, there was no rule against this. Light elemental force. The gaze of the elders and youths sharpened. This was no longer Earth where there were talents at every corner. In such a place, Lionel's light elemental force stuck out like a sore thumb. There wasn't a soul here who didn't understand just how rare light elemental force was. The youths who had been focused on the 2 pillars looked back toward Lionel, a hint of seriousness in their expressions. But, Lionel simply cast, Grand Heal, again and again, lamenting the fact his healing capabilities were still severely lacking. It was only after the last person's life was no longer in danger that he came to a stop and turned his attention toward Aina. What do you think? Lionel was only here to follow, truthfully. He had come here not because he wanted to, but because of Aina. So, he would let her take the lead. The easiest method is to just cross the gates on our own. Aina replied. Lionel looked around. It was clear that they weren't the only one with this idea. Even that woman, Balthorn, was standing here in preparation to go about the same thing. The whole idea of finding then fighting beasts just sounded like a hassle. If one didn't have acute senses like Lionel, you were practically relying on luck. What is your goal for coming here, though? What do you want to accomplish? Aina's gaze sharpened. To become as strong as possible. Lionel grinned, Aina's resolve even making the small hairs on his skin stand at attention. In that case, let's go catch some beasts. Aina blinked, looking at Lionel with a hint of confusion. Wasn't looking for the beasts a waste of time? Why was Lionel suddenly talking about going after them now? However, Lionel didn't explain, taking Ana's small hand and leaving a streak of gold in his wake as he dashed into the forest. The old man raised an eyebrow, watching Lionel's back retreat. But in the end, he shook his head. He had thought that he had run into a talent, but this one actually made the same choice as all the others. This action alone considerably dulled whatever surprise Lionel's light elemental force had given them. They were called Valiant Heart Mountain for a reason. Talent was secondary to them, what was most important was what was within a person's heart. If Lionel wasn't willing to fight and put his life on the line, what worth did his talent have? The youths seemed to agree with the old man's assessment. They had thought that they met another rival, only for him to be a coward. It was quite disappointing indeed. Ironically, it was only Balthorn who looked toward Lionel's receding back with an eyebrow raised. That man. What was he thinking? Unbeknownst to Balthorn, she had already become curious about Lionel. A woman's mind was complex indeed. Why she would feel such a way about a man who had been moments away from killing her just a while ago was beyond normal human understanding. Unfortunately, before she could think any longer, the burly man with twin sabers stepped forward, his heavy steps causing the ground to quake. My name is Inkith Miadan. I don't need your tags, I will climb up this mountain on my own 2 feet. His roar caused the birds in the surroundings to shoot into the skies. Who knew when they would be confident enough to return to their nests? Chapter 598. Inkith's feet stomped forward as he began to make his way up the mountain, his eyes completely focused on the pillars before him. Though the elders of Valiant Heart Mountain stood between the pillars, the youths themselves were a ways down the mountain, a few hundred meters from the foot of the gates, in fact. From their position, sensing the pressure of the gates was impossible. So, in the beginning, Inkith sensed nothing and continued to walk forward and up courageously. However, the instant he crossed the 300-meter line to the gates, a roar suddenly shook his mind. It was so loud and sudden that blood began to ooze from his ears. Despite this, Inkith remained on his own 2 feet, his expression finally growing serious. This roar had no tangible owner. In fact, it looked as though he was the only one to have heard it at all. The elders at the top continued to stand there as though nothing happened, and the youths to his back who had yet to make a move were only watching him without saying a word. It wasn't until blood began dripping from Inkith's ears that the latter group began to feel like something was wrong. However, it was at that exact moment that Inkith began to laugh, beating his fists against his brawny chest until his darkish skin became red. A strong surge of force erupted from him as he shot forward. A barrage of bestial roars assaulted his psyche, making his every step heavy and his every movement labored. But he continued to charge upward, his muscles rippling with vitality and ferocity. The young lady with twin ponytails braided to combine at her chest blinked with curiosity. After a while of watching, she too stepped forward. Irelana of the Fayex tribe. She spoke softly, neatly patting her hair down as she too began to walk up. Balthorn and the pale youth didn't move for a long while. If you keep staring at me like that, I'm going to dig your eyes out. Balthorn said coldly. The pale youth began to cackle. Your tits are practically out for all to see, yet you don't want me to look. Is there no justice in this world? You want to die? Balthorn turned toward the pale youth, her proud chest swaying with her movements like a rippling tide. As long as it's by your hands, I think you'll enter my coffin with a happy expression on my face. Balthorn scoffed. I don't like scrawny men. The pale youth continued to cackle. Let me guess, you like tall, bronzed, and handsome men who already have girlfriends? Balthorn's glare became sharp. However, towards such a response, the pale youth's cackling only became louder. In fact, it seemed to take so much energy out of him that he just might keel over and die at any moment. Though she didn't respond, her lack of one only seemed to make her more guilty. AI, women, women, women. I'll never understand them. Those brats that were flocking around you like a pack of hyenas just ran off, swearing to get you a tag or die trying. Yet, you're standing here thinking about a man who would have killed you for another woman. What should I call you exactly? Balthorn's sharp gaze gave way to a curling smile. What should you call me? How about a beauty you can gaze upon at your own risk, but can never touch regardless? With these words said, Balthorn strode forward, clearly having no intention of waiting for those white knights of hers to retrieve a tag in her stead. As for the trouble they got into trying to do such a thing, she didn't care either. Balthorn Valinor, she said simply and sweetly. Bowing once, she stepped onto the mountain pass. Wait for me, beauty. The pale youth finally moved. As though a shadow, he appeared by Balthorn as though he had always been there. My name is Radlease. The pale youth spoke. But, it seemed that his words were aimed more for Balthorn than the elders above. Aina followed after Lionel with a raised eyebrow, but in the end, she didn't say anything to stop him. As far as she was concerned, Lionel wouldn't do anything to harm her. Plus, even if they fell behind by a step, it didn't really matter much. They were young and time was on their side, who was better and who was worse would be clear soon enough. The two hopped through the trees, streaking past groups of confused youths trying to find beasts to tackle of their own. Among these groups that they passed by, there were no small number of them that were already locked into their own fights to the death. There were over 3,800 participants but only 1,900 beasts. Even when one found a beast to attack, there was no guarantee that there wouldn't be 10 others fighting you to do the same. In a lot of ways, this sort of trial was even more difficult than the trial above. Lionel shook his head as he watched the carnage beneath him. But this time, he didn't raise a finger to help. This was different from before. These were men and women fighting for their futures, who lived and died here would be up to themselves. After a long while, Aina finally couldn't help her curiosity any longer. What's your goal? How will this help? She continued to allow Lionel to pull her along, seemingly enjoying the feeling of his hand enveloping her own. But, she still didn't want to be kept in the dark. Shoo, shoo. We're here. Lionel used a combination of Camelot's silencing spells to achieve the effect of sending his voice directly to Aina once again. The two came to a grinding halt atop a tall tree. Down below, there was what appeared to be a large black bear. It had the characteristic tough fur and large, round body. It even had the rounded ears down perfectly. The only difference was that instead of having light fur around its snout, its own had a fiery shade of red fur. In fact, its eyes were the same striking crimson as though it was prepared and ready to tear anything down at any moment. This. A bear? Aina asked within Lionel's bubble. Lionel grinned. You see a bear. But, I see our first golden tag. Aina's eyes widened, suddenly understanding what Lionel wanted to do. Chapter 599. Seeing Aina's reaction, Lionel grinned and suddenly jumped down from the tree, a massive spear suddenly appearing in his hands. This spear was other than the one he likened to a hammer. But in this situation, it was perfect. Lionel's eyes flashed, a golden domain spreading out around him. In that instant, not only did he become 10 times heavier, but so did the over 5,000-pound spear in his hand. The red-nosed bear suddenly sensed something. It looked up into the skies, a snarl taking over its features. It rose to its hind legs, roaring to the point of foggy, spittle-filled breath assaulting Lionel. A strong red force erupted around the bear, its body growing a size as its fur stood on end. It swiped a paw at the descending Lionel, imagining smashing this pesky human into meat paste. But, at the instant spear and paw met, an overwhelming strength assaulted the bear. Its bones creaked and groaned, before reaching their breaking point and suddenly snapping. A cry of pain left the beast, but its crimson gaze only seemed to become even more so. Lionel shifted his weight until it was as light as a feather, landing on the ground with subtle steps before shooting forward. He gripped the massive spear with both hands, his palms and fingers not large enough to even wrap all the way around its shaft. Yet, he wielded it as though it was no different from an extension of himself. Lionel sent a strong sweep across, pressing down on the injured beast. At that moment, he suddenly winced, feeling the fine cracks in his ribs he had been ignoring to this point. His attack slowed by just a margin, allowing the red-nosed bear to erupt with an even stronger red force. The beast's healthy paw swung downward, coated by a blazing energy. The air in the surroundings heated up, the billowing roars of the bear tearing through the forest's canopy. Bang! The two attacks collided. Lionel's feet sunk into the soft soil, his knees bending and buckling. This beast's strength was no small matter. Lionel could tell why the old man had chosen it to be among those that carried the golden tags. By Lionel's estimation, this beast was at least as strong as a city lord of Terrain, which was about tier 6 of the 4th dimension. Of course, Terrain wasn't exactly known for its talent, so its standard of tier 6 was much lower than that of other worlds. Still, this kind of beast was difficult for Lionel to defeat without using the Four Seasons realm, activating his runes, or using his dreamscape battle sense. Without the help of these factors, Lionel believed that he was actually far worse than this bear. He was only now bridging the gap thanks to two things. The first was his ability. Even without dreamscape battle sense, Lionel's senses were far beyond what most could even aspire to, let alone claim to have. So his reactions and calculations in battle were perfect. The second was the most obvious. His weapon. Lionel was using a quasi-bronze weapon, a treasure a half-step from the 5th dimension, against a beast in the middling 4th dimensional realms. There was no wonder he was able to stand his ground. If this was all, things would be fine. Lionel would still be confident in defeating this beast without tapping into his true strength. But, unfortunately, he was still injured. Just as Lionel was about to clash with the bear again, a shadow suddenly fell from the skies and landed before him. The shadow seemed to only shift slightly, but the roaring of the bear came to an end, just as quickly. Lionel, who had been about to prepare himself for a tough battle, sighed and lowered his spear. "You know, you could have at least pretended that it was difficult," Lionel mumbled. Aina looked back innocently, her eyes blinking behind her mask. "Is your ego so fragile?" "Every man's ego is fragile." Lionel defended himself. Aina giggled. "All right, I don't mind taking a step back then." "You go." Lionel was about to puff up his chest in pride when he suddenly thought of something and turned a gloomy eye toward Aina. Unable to hold it back any longer, Aina burst into a fit of laughter, clenching at her stomach. "Go on now, manly man. Do your job." Disgruntled, Lionel could only step forward. Kneeling beside the beast's corpse, and to the tune of Aina's laughter, he began to cut open the beast's stomach and dig his way through before he finally found the golden tag he was looking for. He stood and tried to turn toward Aina, but she scurried away before he could even approach. She pinched at her nose, still unable to stop her laughter. "Do you feel more manly now?" Lionel looked at the bloody, organ-littered, half-eaten food-covered mess in his hand, half wanting to cry and half wanting to vomit. This girlfriend of his was too cruel. Aina and Lionel shot through the forest, easily finding one golden tag after another. It seemed as though they had a cheat of some sort. The reality, though, wasn't that far from the truth. As the old man had said, each tag was capable of teleporting the one who claimed it past the mountain pass. But the unspoken truth of this was that any beast with this tag was likewise marked by the force arts necessary to allow such teleportation. After realizing this, for Lionel, the matter was simple. His internal sight didn't have a very large range in this world. There was no doubt that this place was a 5th-dimensional world, and as such, not only was the space in Lionel's spatial ring smaller here, but the range of his internal sight was only a few dozen meters to 100 meters at most. However, the fluctuations in these force arts caused small ripples in space. Normally, one wouldn't be able to sense these ripples at all. Not only was the space elemental affinity even more rare than the light elemental affinity, but even if you had it, it was unlikely to be very strong. Lionel, however, had just completed his divine armor, giving him space elemental affinity no worse than almost anyone within the 4th dimension. Though this affinity would be useless to him after he outgrew his divine armor, and was somewhat weaker without summoning the armor itself, this still remained true. Using this affinity, Lionel could easily pick out these tiny changes in space. And, once he locked onto a beast, it was a simple matter of using his internal sight to see whether the tag was gold or not. Beyond that, since he knew that the gold tags would only be in beasts of certain strength, he could just as easily not waste time scanning beasts that were too weak. Like this, Lionel and Aina tore through the mountain range, easily grasping all 10 gold tags without the slightest hint of effort. Well, the effort was minimal on Aina's part. As for the poor sap that was Lionel, he would have to take at least a dozen showers before he felt clean. Chapter 600. There's got to be a better self-cleaning spell than this. Lionel sighed, looking down at himself with a helpless expression. He really got taken advantage of this time around. Though he had already tried to cast several water elemental cleansing spells, his water affinity was so low that it hardly made a difference. To make matters worse, in this fifth-dimensional world, as someone who had yet to touch upon this barrier, affinity was even more important. The higher tier the world, the more it took to move its force. So, all of Lionel's attempts resulted in a light drizzle of water that made Aina sputter with laughter. Still, this didn't stop the two from easily taking down the 10th beast. Now what? Aina asked. Standing over the massive deer with steel-like horns lying beneath them, Lionel pondered for a moment. With these tags, teleporting to the core of Valiant Heart Mountain shouldn't be a problem. Having them in their grasp meant that their task was basically complete. However, before Lionel could answer, a rustling of leaves caught his attention. Under normal circumstances, Lionel would dismiss it as passing wind. With his senses, it was unlikely for anyone to approach so closely without him noticing, least of all those youths who had chosen to come after these tags rather than challenge the mountain pass directly. But, for the first time in a long while, Lionel felt a tingling in his spine. He remembered this feeling well. It was the feeling he got whenever the primitive man's consciousness warned him of something. By now, Lionel had lost count of the number of primitive male and female consciousnesses he had consumed the lives of. Originally, he hadn't thought it would have a great impact on him going into the future, but the more he absorbed, the sharper these instinctive reactions of his became. Ironically, when he was in his cold and calculating battle style, these instincts were dulled considerably. But, whenever he was relaxed and not expecting much, exactly like he was now, those feelings would fire off. Aina seemed to have noticed that something was off as well. Previously, with their senses, they could make out the battles that had been happening in the distance. Considering the number of young geniuses versus the land they had to work with, it was no surprise that the next closest group wouldn't be more than a few hundred meters from you. But at this moment, they heard nothing. Lionel's lip curled. It seems we have company. At that moment, Lionel wished he had a beard to stroke. But, just as always, his face was as bare as a baby's bottom. Do you think you can scare them off with your scent? Lionel coughed. His lack of a beard already ruined his cool moment, but this was just a nail in his coffin. Where was the love and support? Aina giggled, underlaid an increase in the shuffling grass. I wonder, though. If this person has an ability that can cut off my senses, why is it that they've left behind this shuffling grass? Lionel thought aloud. It was clear that neither he nor Aina was taking this matter very seriously. Or, rather, it seemed that they weren't. The truth was that both had already gone on high alert. Everyone participating had already seen the disregard the elders had for the fallen youths. There was clearly an unspoken rule that anything went during these trials. Even if 1 or 2 people wouldn't be difficult to deal with. What if it was dozens? At that moment, as though a veil had been undone, the surroundings were filled with hidden shadows. Beneath the shade of the trees and the foliage of the greenery, Lionel counted the movement of at least 30 individuals. They surrounded the couple from all sides. And though Lionel couldn't clearly see their faces just yet, there was no doubt their intent wasn't to exchange niceties. Lionel didn't seem too surprised by this outcome. There were too many people here, hiding the actions of both he and Aina were almost impossible. There was no doubt that they had been sighted jumping around the forest many times. 1 or 2 battles would have been fine. After all, there were only 2 of them, so they obviously needed to fight 2 battles to get enough tags. But, after the 10th, only a fool wouldn't be able to catch on to what was happening. The only thing Lionel was actually disappointed in was not sensing them previously. But, after some thought, he realized that whoever planned this was quite clever in their own right. For Lionel to be able to so easily pinpoint the golden tags, it would have been obvious to anyone observing that he had great sensory abilities. In that case, how could they not come prepared to deal with this? When the faces finally came into view, Lionel raised an eyebrow. He recognized a few, namely the young lady who had been by Balthorn's side, Henoran. But, following her were several youths that had been flocking around Balthorn as though she was a goddess. Somehow, though, despite how rowdy these youths were, Lionel got the faint feeling that they were following Henoran's directive. It was an odd feeling indeed, especially considering the young lady was in the middle of the group, lightly clasping her hands together at her waist as though she didn't plan on raising a single finger. Despite Lionel's feelings, though, the one who stepped forward wasn't Henoran at all, but rather a young man who had threatened to skewer him with a weapon for the sake of Balthorn not even a few hours ago. The sneer on the man's face could make a baby cry, Lionel was certain of it. You know why we're all here, let's not beat around the bush. I've already let you go once and have no intention of doing it again. Hand over the tags you've collected and you might leave this place unscathed. Lionel sighed inwardly. You really couldn't underestimate this world of abilities. Even the weaklings could catch you off guard if they were lucky enough. That said, Lionel yawned beside himself. Though he had just awoken from a few days' long rest not long ago, he had a massive meal right afterward, then proceeded to battle in this damned forest for the next few hours. With how weak his body was currently, he already felt like taking another nap. Let's go. Lionel spoke to Aina. The sneer on the young man's face deepened. But, just as quickly, it froze. A black surfboard appeared to Lionel's feet and he grabbed at Aina. Instinctively, Aina wanted to dodge. I'd rather fight to the death. She protested. But, Lionel grinned, giving her a massive bear hug as they shot into the skies. Bye. Lionel waved. Chapter 601. The youths were absolutely stunned. A flying treasure? What kind of joke was this? Of all the ways they expected things to end, this was the very last. This wasn't because they were too stupid to consider it a possibility but rather because wasting time considering such a thing would have been exactly that, a waste of time. One had to understand that everything changed when one rose in the dimensions. Just like there were some airplanes that couldn't rise above a certain altitude without stalling, the same logic applied to the flying treasures of the dimensional verse. The flying treasures these youths were used to were only tier 4 or 5 black-grade treasures at best. These kind of flying treasures would hardly rise 10 meters into the air in a fifth-dimensional world. Knowing this, why would they even consider this to be a problem? They had no way of knowing that Lionel had a tier 9 black-grade treasure. He was easily able to rise up 20 meters before he even began to feel some resistance. The young man who headed their mission, a youth who went by the name of Emerald, was just as shocked as everyone else. But, he also reacted quickly. Shoot them down. Unfortunately, by the time the words had come out, Lionel and Aina were already 25 meters above the ground. Not enough. Using the trees as cover, Lionel weaved in and out of the foliage, making use of the terrain to protect both himself and Aina. However, in the back of his mind, he was already planning to improve this surfboard. He could feel that it was working hard just to keep him this high off the ground, any higher and it might collapse entirely. Luckily, the forest landscape was in Lionel's favor. Getting out of range of the youths below was a simple matter of planning a path and following suit. Not only was Lionel able to pick out those with long-ranged abilities, he was also able to project their lines of sight in his mind as well. After that, avoiding them was as easy as breathing. Not having expected such a result, Emerald hadn't even prepared a large corps of ranged units. He could only watch as Lionel shot through the skies and disappeared. Damn it. Emerald punched a thick tree hard. Yet, despite his strength, barely a dent was made. He looked no different from a mortal of the third dimension completing the same exact action. Henneren's eyes narrowed as Lionel disappeared over the horizon. But, she didn't pursue. She could tell that these matters were already as good as over. Aina wheezed and Dry heaved under the chorus of Lionel's laughter. Karma is a beautiful thing. Aina glared at him through her mask, but Dry heaved again just as she was about to come back with a smart reply. You know, you should probably take your mask off if you want to vomit, just saying. Lionel grinned. But in response, he only got another glare. The two landed in the same mountain pass they had been in when they were first teleported to this planet. Truthfully, Lionel had just wanted to teleport to Valiant Heart Mountain immediately, but Aina insisted that being baptized by the pressure of the pillars was good training. The elder of Valiant Heart Mountain had been in a good mood. Though he had said that he wouldn't accept any youths who could cross these gates and that they would have 3 years to do so or be kicked out. The truth was that he said that every year. These pillars were actually a portal to Valiant Heart Mountain's sacred land, and only disciples of the highest standing even had a chance to enter that place. Of course, at the moment, this portal wasn't active. So, even if these youths managed to cross it, it wouldn't be much more than a symbolic victory. But, the elder was also aware that the earlier these youths crossed this trial, the more benefit they would gain from it in the future. So, during every acceptance ceremony, he would tease the youths in this exact way, forcing them to walk up the mountains. Those who were able to make it even halfway were rewarded by him. Not only would they gain his favor, but he would personally kill the beasts that held the golden tags and hand them over as a reward. The truth was that the beasts were just a bait, especially the golden tag ones. For one, amongst the beasts, there were many without tags at all. The smart youths who were more confident in their strength would think of targeting the more powerful beasts. It made sense, the more powerful a beast, the more likely it would have a golden tag. Though this might be true, the reality was much harsher. Though the elder had followed these rules, he had also left behind several dummies. Some of these dummies didn't have tags at all, while most only had normal tags. The elder thought himself to be quite clever. He believed that only youths with the greatest courage would choose to challenge the mountain pass, while the others weren't worth considering at all. Of course, he didn't even consider the fact that battling beasts and putting your life on the line against the most powerful of them was also a form of courage. But, given his age, he had long since been set in his ways. And it especially didn't help in changing his mind that the youths from this year seemed to be far more talented than the norm. It couldn't help but bring a bright smile to his face. Inketh had crossed the 80% mark already and was just 60 or so meters from the pillar. Iranla was not far behind, being less than 5 meters from the back of the hulking giant. And, this was most likely due to the fact she had started a step later. Balthorn was struggling the worst of the 4 of them. Droplets of sweats beaded down her pretty face and blood leaked from her lips as her every step seemed to cause her no small amount of damage. But, she continued to trudge forward. Just be my girlfriend and I'll carry you up. Come on. Radlease almost seemed unaffected. If it wasn't for the fact his back was hunched just a little bit more, others would think he really was immune. But, at the moment, Balthorn wanted nothing more than to cut off his tongue. The elder suddenly looked up to find Lionel and Aina landing in the opening, his brow furrowed with confusion. You stay here, you're still injured. Aina said strictly. I'll go. This isn't very important to you anyway. You just want to get away from the stink, don't you? Yes. Aina held nothing back. No love in this world. Aina felt glad she was wearing a mask at that moment. If not for it, she wouldn't be able to hide her smile. All right, I'm going. Under the stunned gazes of everyone, Aina suddenly began to sprint up the mountain pass. Chapter 602. Lionel's lip curled into a smile, but he didn't chase after Aina. She was right, his body really was in no condition to deal with such pressure. Though the other youths couldn't sense it by standing where he was now, Lionel's senses were too sharp not to. Those pillars made Brave City look like nothing more than a joke. And Lionel was absolutely certain that this was only a fraction of the strength these pillars could display. It seemed like nothing more than a coincidence that the elders were standing before them like that. But Lionel had a feeling that if they were to move away, let alone traveling up so far as those four had already done, they might not even make it 10% of the way through. That said, as long as those elders kept nerfing the mountain pass oppression, Lionel had the utmost confidence in Aina. As though blazing a trail, Aina shot up the mountain, making it from Lionel's side to the 300-meter mark in the blink of an eye. She seemed to embody the perfect form of a sprinter with her every movement. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary movements. She almost felt no different from a machine designed to kill. Though Lionel could replicate this feat by undergoing several calculations before deciding just which form of running suited him best, Aina was different. She needed to rely on nothing other than her talent and intuition, leaving her in a realm all to her own. The elders thought that Aina was clearly overestimating herself. To have little to no regard for the mountain pass in such a way, even sprinting up as though it was a race rather than what it truly was, a fight to the death, they could only conclude that much. Even Inkith had slowly crossed this line of demarcation before slowly building up momentum. But Aina didn't even take a deep breath before crossing over the line. Of course, one reason for this was because Aina's senses were considerably dulled due to her curse. In fact, if it wasn't for her sight and hearing being so abnormal, her sensory perception would be no better than a normal human's. So, truthfully, she didn't sense the line of division as clearly as everyone else did. But, on the other hand, it hardly mattered. Aina shot through the line. Her first step sunk her body so low that it seemed as though she might trip over and fall, the pressure bearing down on her shoulders relentlessly. But, she recovered quickly, her thigh bulging with strength as she sprung upward. As though a blade cutting through a curtain of falling water, she sliced through, leaping forward 10 meters in a single bound. Lionel's lip curled more prominently. One would have thought that it was him accomplishing such a feat rather than Aina. But, in his mind, there was little difference between the two. The elder's eyes widened. To recover so quickly after a change in gravity without faltering, and even more importantly, without hurting oneself, was... Well, the elder could only say that it should have been impossible. In that instant, he was certain that Aina should have, at least, broken her planting leg. But, her muscles recovered and protected the bones they surrounded as though they had a mind of their own. The time they had to react? It was other than the split moment between Aina raising her foot and it landing on the ground. It simply didn't make sense for a young girl at the beginning stages of the fourth dimension to have such fast reaction time, and it was even more impossible for her to have honed such instincts so quickly. But, even as the elder was lost in his shock, Aina had already barreled through another 40 meters, crossing the 50-meter mark with no sign of slowing down. Her body crackled and popped, her bones threatening to fracture and break. But, to Aina, this sort of trial was nothing. She was a woman who trained herself by breaking her own bones, rending her inner organs, and sweating until what came out was nothing less than streams of her own blood. Such tortures, such horrors, they meant nothing. She faced the howling beasts in her mind as though she had something to prove, as though there was nothing more important to her at this very moment than to face them boldly and confidently. The fear she felt when facing the puppet master was a blemish she had long since seared into her heart. It wasn't a humiliation in the way a man might feel it. Aina just felt as though she had let herself down. That was the first time she had ever faced true death, the first time she had realized that her talent wasn't enough to leap over the final hurdle. While Lionel had to deal with such a feeling upon entering his first zone, Aina most definitely did not. She had been training ever since she was a youth. To her, her first zone was nothing more than a formality. It could be said that this was the first time she had had to face the fear of not being strong enough, of being inadequate. It was quite the feeling indeed. Because she had lost control of her body and had been unable to move, she had no way of telling herself that she had faced the trial bravely. As such, the feeling of helplessness and self-blame only seemed to cycle and grow. Lionel watched Aina tear her way up the mountain, a light smile still on his face. He knew well that the scared little girl he saw that day wasn't his Aina. Unfortunately, unable to move, she hadn't been able to prove that clearly to herself. This time, Lionel was content to take a back seat and allow the limelight to shine on her. His smile suddenly spread into a grin. If my girlfriend is so amazing, doesn't that mean I get bonus points? Chapter 603. Huh. Radlease and Balthorn looked back in confusion. In truth, of the four youthful geniuses had been paying attention. Or, rather, they simply didn't have the luxury to do so. Walking up the mountain pass was difficult enough, how could they have time to waste on looking back? But, at a certain point, it simply couldn't be ignored any longer. The rushing winds, the trembling grounds, the second oppressive aura that seemed to be bearing down on them from the back. They simply couldn't continue to pay attention to the path before them any longer. When they did finally look back and see what was happening, their eyes couldn't help but widen in shock. By now, Aina was already no more than 10 meters behind them. But, just as quickly as they gazed back, they were leveled just as fast. And, even faster than that, they were surpassed. Radlease and Balthorn stumbled. Their loss of concentration made them feel as though the pressure on their bodies had been multiplied several times over, and in the end, they all but fell to their knees. Aina blazed a trail by them. To an outside observer, she was only sprinting as fast as a normal human, a speed that was less than impressive for a fourth-dimensional existence. However, in the face of these youths, she might as well have been flying. A gaze of determination lit Aina's every step forward. Even though her speed was continuously slowing, she seemed to show no intention of stopping. She pushed harder and harder, her steps eventually becoming so heavy that miniature cracks began to appear beneath her feet. At some unknown time, Lionel had crossed his arms, his fingernails digging into his biceps. But, at the same time, the smile on his face didn't fade, almost as though to keep up a strong front just in case she looked back. Aina entered a 50-meter distance from Inkith. Then 40. Then 30. Her arms and legs moved in unison as though swimming through a tide of heavy water. Though her face was blocked by a mask, the weight of her determination alone painted a broader picture than what her expression alone could bring across. Even Lionel had underestimated just how much this matter meant. He had only come here for Aina's sake, but it wasn't until this moment that he truly grasped the kind of determination it took for a young woman to send herself across the universe alone and without backers. Aina had never thought of coming to Valiant Heart Mountain with Lionel. In fact, maybe she thought that after being sent to Terrain, she would never see Lionel again. It might have been cruel, especially since at the time she hadn't even been aware of if Lionel managed to survive or not. But, Lionel couldn't find it within himself to blame her for this. The relationship between he and Aina was still nothing more than a teenage infatuation. However, the weight Aina carried on her shoulders was far more than just this. She carried the betrayal of her family. She carried the scars of a little girl. She carried the death of a parent. Lionel couldn't blame her if she placed these things ahead of him in importance. It would be nothing short of selfish of him to not understand. Maybe in a way, to Aina, the act of ignoring her feelings for him was just another form of sacrifice, another hardship she had to face to reach the day she could lay down these burdens. That drive, that will to reach a goal no matter what you had to sacrifice. Though Lionel couldn't understand it, he respected it down to the depths of his heart. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever have such great drive. Would there ever be something he was willing to give up everything for? The thought made him shudder. Did he really have to give up the things that he loved for the sake of such a goal? Lionel looked up into the skies. Even if there comes a day where I have such a goal. I would never be able to do that. No, Lionel shook his head. He didn't feel as though he was expressing his own thoughts properly. He had emotions deep within him, emotions he knew existed but couldn't quite place a label on. At that moment, Lionel suddenly smiled. Aina said it best. We men are selfish and always want more. And, the man I want to be doesn't just want more, he wants everything. Even if there comes a day where I have such a goal, even if it forces me at an impasse where I must choose between the things that I love, I'll cut a path down the middle and take both. I don't like to lose, after all. Lionel's aura shifted, a breeze kicking up around him. For a moment, the elder atop the mountain pass took his eyes off of the blazing Aina and couldn't help but gaze upon the inconspicuous youth standing amidst a vast nothingness. Even with his years of experience, he didn't understand why he had looked at Lionel in that moment. In fact, even if he asked Lionel why, the young man wouldn't be able to answer either. Lionel's thoughts seemed to have been formulated into words and coherent thought, but the truth was that he didn't think those phrases and sentences just now. In fact, his mind was quite blank at the moment, not exuding anything close to a coherent stream of consciousness. The current Lionel was still not able to put these emotions into words. Rather, those words represented nothing more than a raw, unrefined ambition. The first budding of a sprout yet to be properly watered. Maybe even Lionel didn't realize it at that moment, but he suddenly felt free and unbothered. He was content to bide his time and wait for the moment that small bud bloomed forth. Aina gave a resounding cry into the skies, her axe appearing in her seemingly delicate hands as she slashed downward with all her might. She tore into the ground beneath her feet, hooking her blade into the soil and using it as an anchor to shoot forward. She leapt through the air, landing 3 meters ahead before swinging her axe downward once more and repeating. Her momentum was relentless, her mind blank of all thoughts but the image of the pillars before her. Under the stunned gazes of all those that could witness it, she crossed the final line, her long black hair whipping about beneath a furious aura. The whites of her eyes rolled forth as she roared into the skies, the carvings of the pillars suddenly beginning to glow. Chapter 604. Aina's roar caused a shockwave to tear a path across the mountain pass. For a moment, the illusion of a woman much taller than her seemed to envelop her small figure. However, this lasted for but a moment before a strong surge of force fell from the glowing pillars, enveloping her body in a rain of light. Lionel snapped out of his thoughts, the strength of his fingers digging into his forearm growing to the point he nearly drew blood. He had no idea what was happening, and if it wasn't for the fact he wasn't sure what he'd do even if he stormed his way up, there was no way that he'd be able to sit idle for so long. The elders standing amidst the pillars suddenly all sported frozen expressions. Whatever shocked looks they had just had seemed to be ramped up several-fold. The 4 geniuses who had been surpassed by Aina suddenly found that continuing forward had become impossible. One after another, they fell to their knees, a look of abject horror on their face. Even Inkith, a man who didn't seem to understand anything that could be solved without brawn, felt his heart trembling. However, though these geniuses fell, each and every one of them kept their eyes level. It was as though each was holding on to the last bit of their pride, unable to allow themselves to fall to the point of not even daring to look. Aina's body had completely disappeared within the lights. The pulsing of the twin pillars grew more heated, reaching a level where even the elders could no longer think of holding back the pressure themselves. Unable to hold back his thoughts any longer, Lionel flipped a palm, causing a familiar silver disc to appear in his hand. Valiant Heart Mountain was a place maybe more fanciful than even Lionel expected. Beyond the mountain range, there sat an all-new world, the kind the people of Earth could have maybe only dreamed about. Valiant Heart Mountain was split into 7 peaks, each of which seemed to thrum with a heartbeat of its own. These peaks were all surrounded by floating islands. But, compared to the paradise islands of Earth, these islands exuded an air of oneness with nature rather than capitalistic greed. They had lush greenery viewable even from the ground below, a land that shone a faint sheen of gold, and hovered in place without the slightest hint of technology. But, what was maybe the most awe-inspiring were the waterfalls that fell from their edges. These waterfalls fell in steady streams, sparkling with and refracting the light of a high violet-colored sun that hung in the air. This refraction gave the water a gorgeous purple hue that played on the fantasies of all. But this wasn't all. These waters fell from the skies and into long, rushing rivers along the peaks they orbited. The seamless transition between the waterfalls and the clouds to the rivers running along the earth made everything look as though it was crafted by the hands of a mighty deity. Still, as beautiful as this scenery might be, those that were here had long since gotten used to it. The hustle and bustle of Valiant Heart Mountain didn't seem to stop even in the face of such sights. But, maybe, this was the human condition. Even in higher dimensional worlds, ignoring the miracles of nature seemed to be ingrained into our very souls. At that moment, though, among one of the peaks of Valiant Heart Mountain, all things seemed to have come to a stop. As with many other powers, Valiant Heart Mountain was divided into several factions. But, this particular peak, known as Founding Peak, was a location not of a particular one of these factions, but rather the gathering place of the most powerful members of Valiant Heart. In recent days, this location had been rife with debates, each speaking over the other about the direction the organization should go in. But, at this moment, they had suddenly fallen into an eerie silence. In fact, not a single soul seemed to be speaking. They all stopped what they were doing, simultaneously looking in a singular direction. At the base of this mountain, there was a section reserved for the future leaders of Valiant Heart Mountain. In truth, they only spent time here as a symbol of their superiority and used it to organize members of their faction. If this location was to be strictly compared to their normal training locations, it was severely lacking. The base of Founding Peak simply couldn't compare to the peaks of the other 6 peaks despite the fact the peak of Founding Peak was unmatched. Someone activated the founding pillars? It was unknown who spoke these words, nor did it particularly matter. All these youths who had gained the right to set up camp at the base of Founding Mountain were all preparing to accept the new influx of talents into their factions at this exact moment. However, not one had ever expected this particular outcome. Though these youths were separated by several hundred meters, even kilometers in some cases, not a single one hesitated. Without regard for the rules, or even the overseeing elders, they all sent their most trusted subordinate out. They all only had a singular goal: to recruit. At the peak of Founding Peak, there was a single core group that stood above all the rest. It was a group of 3 men and 3 women, each that had been in silent meditation all to their own. At the core of this group, though, there was one more man. It was this man who sat upon the tallest floating island, not moving even while thick white clouds passed through him, causing fine sprits of water droplets to drizzle across his bronzed skin. He opened his eyes somewhat lazily, staring into the distance as though he could peer through the mountains and the thick forests to gaze upon the pillars directly. When the man saw what was happening, his apathetic expression became one of pleasant surprise. The reason he hadn't cared initially was because he was certain that the one to activate the pillars would have been that child he had been warned about all those months ago. But seeing as it wasn't him, a pleasant surprise indeed. It was only after the lights began to dim that Lionel breathed a sigh of relief. At the very least, it didn't seem as though there was anything seriously wrong with Aina. At least, not initially. The moment Lionel thought Aina would be fine, she fell to the ground on all fours, unable to hold on to her battle axe anymore. A violent fit of coughing took hold of her. Lionel's gaze sharpened. He immediately understood that something had aggravated Aina's curse again. He could even see the mask he had crafted her begin to bulge as her scars became more aggravated. But, just when things seemed as though they would get out of hand, Aina's mask began to glow. A strong pulse of cool cleansing waters was sprayed over her face again and again. Aina gripped at the earth with her fingers, leaving small trails as she balled her hands into fists. Soon, the pain she was racked by slowly ebbed, her ragged breathing becoming more even. Lionel took a deep breath. He could only be relieved that the contingency plans he had left in place worked. Lionel's gaze suddenly shifted from Aina's back to the distance. Beyond the pillars, several auras converging at speeds he couldn't hope to keep up with under normal circumstances were coming. Lionel felt that there were some of them that were even more powerful than the elders who had come to preside over this entrance ceremony, a fact that gave him no small measure of pause. It didn't take much thought for Lionel to connect their appearance with the commotion Aina had caused. Just as Aina was picking herself up, the 6 auras had already come into range. The elder who had led this event from the beginning looked back and frowned. "You all aren't allowed to be here." "Hee, Elder Tobies, there's no need to be so uptight." The young man who spoke was almost 8 feet tall. He was easily the tallest individual Lionel had ever laid eyes on. His posture was terrible, his back arching forward to the point he appeared to be a foot shorter than he truly was. But his exposed torso was filled with an unprecedented amount of power. Lionel thought that he was in good shape, as he had been all his life, but this man had muscles bulging out of places he never thought possible. His limbs were long and lanky, his legs almost taking up a third of his body and his reaching past his knees, though that was likely in part due to the fact his posture was so terrible. Elder Tobies glared at the youth and the few that had come with him. He knew exactly who these youths were. In any other situation, he would be grinning ear to ear that his valiant Heart Mountain had such talent. But here, they were clearly stepping over a line. Hephaestus. Unfortunately, before Tobies could reprimand the young man anymore, Hephaestus had already turned his attention to Aina, who had long since picked herself up. Oh, a little girlie. "Hey, little chick, what do you say to joining my hero peak? Important announcement below, be sure to read it." Chapter 605. Aina stood somewhat weakly. Her body had hardly gained its bearings when she was suddenly asked this question. She sent a look toward Hephaestus, her gaze placid. The truth was that Aina had heard about Valiant Heart Mountain from Yuri. As a result, she had a small understanding of it. If not for this, why else would she prepare a ticket to Terrain to come here? That said, it could also be said that Aina had no choice but to choose this place. Valiant Heart Mountain was the overlord of this quadrant and several other quadrants. Only the most well-established worlds with the strongest foundations could afford to send their youths to other organizations outside of their jurisdiction. For Earth, a place where even a ticket to a world considered to be relatively close by, like Terrain, cost a Tier 9 black-grade treasure, it was obviously an impossible dream to think of traveling so far. With their foundation, Aina didn't even want to think about what it would cost to go to a place other than Valiant Heart Mountain. This was all to say that Aina had heard of Hero Peak before. In fact, she had heard of all 7 peaks of Valiant Heart. Founding Peak, Hero Peak, Brave Peak, Justice Peak, Honor Peak, Loyal Peak, Respect Peak. One wouldn't be surprised to find out, then, that the Brave City Lionel and Aina took their trial in was constructed by Brave Peak. Other various peaks would have their own testing means. That said, just because they were tested by Brave City, didn't mean that they couldn't choose to join another peak. The various city establishments were just a way of parsing the burden of recruitment. In the end, Valiant Heart Mountain was still a singular entity. The youths who had come with Hephaestus immediately wanted to say something to cut him off. How could they just allow him to say and do as he pleased? They didn't want to make their trip a worthless one. But, before they could, Aina spoke. "Are you the strongest?" It was a simple sentence. Spoken in 4 words, it seemed to speak 1,000. There was no other question Aina wanted answered, no other that was more important to her. This and this alone was all that mattered. Hephaestus was stunned by the question for a moment before he began to laugh uproariously. "You hear that, you bastards? This little girlie will be joining Hero Peak. You weaklings can all take a step back." The expressions of the others' youths soured immediately, but they said nothing to refute. There was no doubting Hero Peak's strength. In the last 20 years, there had been no singular peak able to supplant their rule. Hephaestus turned his attention back to Aina. Though his posture was terrible, his body exuded a bestial strength that made his bones pop and crackle with his every movement. "Not only is Hero Peak the strongest, we have been the strongest for the last quarter century. We have the strongest warriors, the best facilities and the most resources. On top of that, our leader, the hero Raylion, is the strongest of the 6 leaders. If even that isn't enough for you, even me, as a mere little vice leader, could wipe the floor with some of these other so-called leaders. Hephaestus grinned from ear to ear, towering over the petite Aina. There's no better choice than us. Aina looked up at Hephaestus, her gaze somewhat distant and emotionless. She didn't seem moved by his display. Hephaestus felt smaller in comparison to the puppet master. But, with her poor senses, Aina couldn't tell whether this was an illusion or not. Okay. Aina said plainly. Hephaestus scanned Aina up and down, sending a curious look toward her mask. But, he seemed even more shocked by her demeanor. Even that old fogey Tobias wouldn't feel so comfortable before him. You heard her, old man. Hephaestus turned toward elder Tobias. She made her own decision. You saw that I didn't force her, right? Hephaestus' toothy grin made it hard for Tobias to refrain from rolling his eyes. The reason these brats weren't supposed to be allowed to interfere at this juncture was because it was too easy for them to influence the decisions of these youths by underhanded means. And, even in the case that didn't happen, there was precedent for fights breaking out during recruitment. As such, it was usual policy to allow the youths a few days to soak in the atmosphere of valiant heart for themselves and then choose a peak that was right for them. In such a situation, the youths would have to pass an exam of sorts, far different from Aina, who seemed capable of joining without such a thing. But, it was thanks to these rules that a relative peace was able to be kept in what would have otherwise been a violent few weeks. Since Aina had made her own decision and didn't seem to be pressured in any way, though, there was no reason for him to interfere. From what he could see, whether he stopped her here or not, Aina would end up joining Hero Peak regardless. Though there were many rules in Valiant Heart, there was one ultimate rule that ruled all others: strength. Since Hephaestus and Aina had the capital, they could do as they pleased. At that moment, Aina looked back to meet Lionel's gaze. But, all she found was a young man grinning with 2 thumbs up by the sides of his cheeks. He looked so happy, almost as though it was his own achievement rather than hers. Aina couldn't help but think that he looked quite goofy, a sight that made her sputter with laughter. Hephaestus and elder Tobias were taken off guard by the sudden change in the valiant young lady. They didn't even know a person with such a demeanor could laugh in such a way. Hephaestus raised an eyebrow as he looked toward where Aina was looking. In the end, he chose to not bother with the exchange as he swept a glance over the 4 geniuses kneeling along the mountain pass. Hero Peak has no need for losers. This will be our only recruit during this recruitment cycle. Hephaestus' disposition completely changed. It felt as though the mountain above had fused with him, his lofty air looking down with an undying arrogance. Chapter 606. Hearing these words, Aina frowned. She had expected Hero Peak to be relatively exclusive, but she hadn't worried about it. With Lionel's talent, was there really anything exclusive enough to keep him out? If there was a test, there would be no issue. But, from what Hephaestus said, there would no longer be a recruitment test. In truth, Hephaestus' actions weren't exactly wrong. Over the past few years, having even one person pass Hero Peak's exam was already a blessing. He was already content with having found Aina, so he didn't feel that there was even a need to waste resources testing anymore. Every exam took up a sum of wealth from Hero Peak, and there were no shortage of people who would come despite knowing they had no chance of passing. This would result in Hero Peak's expenses being far greater than they would otherwise be. Usually, this could be solved with a simple screening process, but this took resources to build up as well. This was especially so since Hero Peak emphasized not base power, but rather potential. This was exactly why a comprehensive exam was more appropriate than having a screening process. But now that Hephaestus had found a recruit, and especially with the precarious situation Valiant Heart was in currently, why waste these resources? It would be much easier to reach their goals if they saved as much as they could and reinvested it into the talents that actually mattered. Even if Aina could guess much of these things, though, she didn't want to leave Lionel behind. At least for now, she didn't feel like making such a decision was necessary. She had yet to reach such a crossroads. And, even if this wasn't about her feelings and she could shed them all away to think about this as logically as possible, the resources Lionel had access to were likely impossible to find in Valiant Heart. Just as cleansing waters alone, which could keep her curse under control, was a rarity impossible to explain. Every time she tried to tell Lionel just how valuable cleansing waters were, he would point to the toilet bowl in his abode setting. It was mildly infuriating. Of course, Aina didn't think of Lionel in terms of the resources he could provide. She had gotten used to being by his side over the past near year. She didn't want to leave him so soon even if they would technically be in the same place. "Can't you hold one more test?" Aina suddenly asked. Hephaestus frowned when he heard these words. Instead of his gaze shifting to lock onto Aina, it instead swept over her briefly before locking onto Lionel in the distance. He had ignored Lionel previously for obvious reasons. If he looked down on a young man and woman like Inkith and Irelana who had made it more than 80% of the way up, why would he even deem to speak to someone who didn't even start? This young lady might have been talented, but she didn't understand the weight of an expert's words. Since he had already said that they wouldn't be accepting anyone else, wouldn't he be a joke if he suddenly took those words back not even a few seconds after he had stated them? "Listen, little chick. You might be a bit talented, but it seems you haven't understood something. Now that you've joined Hero Peak, you are at the bottom of the totem pole. Even the servants that sweep the floors are above you. What makes you think you can ask something like this of me?" From start to finish, Hephaestus didn't look at Aina. Rather, he had his eyes locked onto Lionel as though he was giving a silent warning. Aina's brows furrowed. She most definitely didn't like being spoken to like that. She couldn't be considered to have a temper, nor was she as prideful as Lionel, but that didn't mean everyone didn't have their own bottom line. "He could have walked up the mountain pass just like I did. It's just that our world was in the middle of a war and he got heavily injured during it. His body isn't in any condition to withstand such pressure." Hephaestus' aura sharpened. This little girl actually still dared to talk back to him? A man who backs away from a challenge just because he's a little hurt. You think that this is enough of an excuse? Hero Peak has no need for such weak-willed trash. Hephaestus' gaze swept back toward Aina. "Since you don't seem to know your place, that's fine too. From now on, even if your little boyfriend recovers and has some strength, he won't be allowed to join my Hero Peak." It seemed that this little girl didn't understand the meaning of hierarchy. Just because he was here to personally recruit her, didn't mean that her standing was suddenly the equivalent of his. In addition, according to the rules of Valiant Heart, the transfer from one peak to another was considered an internal dispute. The unsaid truth was that now that Hero Peak had laid claim to Aina, there was no other peak that would dare take her now lest they want to become more acquainted with what internal dispute might mean in this context. Aina's gaze flashed with fury when she heard these words. Seeing the situation going south, Lionel began to walk up the mountain pass. Unfortunately, since the pillars had recently given a large blessing to Aina, it would take some weeks before they could recover to their original strength. At the moment, walking up the mountain pass was only slightly more difficult than walking anywhere else within this fifth-dimensional world. It was akin to a 5% boost to gravity. It wasn't long before Aina felt a hand on her shoulder, stopping her from gripping at her axe which was nailed into the ground beside her. Lionel smiled. "It's not a big deal. As long as this vice leader doesn't use underhanded tricks to make your stay at Hero Peak more difficult than it needs to be, it's the best place for you." Hephaestus almost laughed at these words. How many brats were going to challenge him today? Did they want to die? Bulging veins suddenly popped across Hephaestus' right hand. It seemed like with a thought, had pierced Lionel's heart through completely. But, at that moment, he felt Elder Toby's aura lock onto him, causing him to slowly calm himself. Hephaestus sneered. "Everything on Hero Peak is earned through merit." "Good," Lionel said plainly. Somehow, this answer only infuriated Hephaestus more. Lu. Lionel shook his head, cutting Aina off and taking out 10 golden tags. Take them. Chapter 607. You. Aina didn't know how to respond. Keep half of them. Lionel shook his head. I don't really need anything from their vaults, honestly. There's nothing they can provide that I can't build. Especially considering the best weapon the vice leader of the strongest peak has is only tier 7 black. If you don't find anything you want, just trade the tags in for some ores you like and I'll build something better. Aina was speechless when she heard Lionel say these words. In truth, the Lionel she knew very rarely got angry. Even when she teased him to oblivion, he only retaliated in the most benign of ways. The only time she had ever seen him truly enraged was with the puppet master and the Reynard, Pisces situation. But those things, in her opinion, were warranted. This was all to say that Aina didn't know that Lionel could actually be so petty. Hearing his words, even Elder Tobias couldn't help but frown despite the fact he had practically just saved Lionel's life. Did someone kick this kid in the head? A tier 7 black grade treasure was about the best one could expect a 4th-dimensional entity to wield. Only 5th-dimensional existences might begin to wield tier 8 and 9 black grade treasures. At least this was the case in this part of the universe. Only 6th-dimensional worlds had a large number of bronze grade treasures. Likewise, only 7th-dimensional worlds had a large number of silver grade treasures. No matter how you sliced it, it looked as though Lionel was making an immature comment about something he hardly understood. The words alone made whatever impact gathering 10 golden tags might have fall flat. Of those here, maybe it was only Aina who understood how truthful Lionel was being. Let alone a tier 7 black grade treasure, Lionel could already begin constructing tier 1 bronze grade treasures, each of which would be exponentially more powerful than even a quasi-bronze grade treasure, of which he had no small number of. Lionel simply didn't care about what Hephaestus or Elder Tobias thought of him because he never cared to join this organization in the first place. If Lionel had to pick out one reason he didn't try to convince Aina of taking a different path, it would have to be because of the segmented cube. This was the first time Lionel had stepped foot into a 4th-dimensional world, so this was also the first time the segmented cube could begin to absorb 5th-dimensional force. Albeit slowly, the segmented cube was working its way toward entering Phase 3. Once it did so, Lionel would be able to heal Aina. Lionel slid the tags into Aina's hand. Oh, also. Lionel suddenly thought of something. Take this with you too. The tags were sucked into the jigsaw-like cube. Soon, all that was left on Aina's palm was the segmented cube itself. Alright, off you go. Seeing that Aina didn't seem apt to leave, Lionel laughed. He leaned into her ear and spoke softly. Even if the others tried, they wouldn't be able to hear what he was saying. But that didn't stop Aina's neck from flushing red. Do you think that there's any barrier in this place that can stop me? The words were simple, no more complex than Aina's question for Hephaestus. But they reverberated with Aina deeply. Okay. Aina said lightly, taking the cube. Hephaestus didn't say anything. He simply turned and walked away. What only he and Lionel seemed to be aware of was the fact there was a strong killing intent locked onto the latter from start to finish. Yet, Lionel had hardly reacted. The cause of this matter was clear. This wasn't about how strong Lionel was or wasn't, it was simply about a man deeming his word as more important than the word of any other. Hephaestus didn't care what reasoning Lionel had, since he had spoken his word, he wouldn't take it back. This was exactly the same reason why he hadn't booted Aina out from Hero Peak. Lionel smiled and waved as Aina disappeared into the distance. It was only after she was gone that his gaze became cold and the atmosphere seemed to become frozen. When did I become so murderous? Lionel thought to himself. If it wasn't for the sake of Aina, he really might have killed Hephaestus just then. Lionel felt as though his inhibitions against killing were loosening each and every day. Would there really come a time where he reaped lives like cutting weeds? he didn't really like the feeling. If he killed Hephaestus, what then? Wouldn't he be cutting off Aina's path? And where would he find another fifth-dimensional world to station himself in? Lionel had learned a lot about the dimensional verse in recent times, more than enough to understand that traveling up a dimension was no simple task. At the very least, with Earth's current infrastructure, the price would likely near a silver-grade treasure. This was obviously something Lionel couldn't afford. If he was forced to leave this place too soon, he didn't know when he'd be able to cure Aina. Brat, you're too impulsive. Lionel, who was lost in his own thoughts as though there weren't others around him, was suddenly startled awake. Lionel raised an eyebrow. He was impulsive? If the old man knew what was going on in his mind, had realized just how much prudence Lionel had shown just now. Whether or not Lionel could actually defeat Hephaestus was unknown even to him. But, what Lionel was sure of was that Hephaestus would suffer greatly if he had to battle him. Elder Toby shook his head and looked back toward the other faction vice leaders. But, it was clear that of them were very interested in the youths that remained. If they wanted to join, they could take the exam like everyone else. And while they would allow this for the four geniuses to Lionel's back, it was unlikely that they'd make room for Lionel himself after what they just saw. Youths should learn to bide their time. What good does your killing intent do you now? Lionel raised an eyebrow at these words. But, he didn't say much as he made his way up the mountain pass. His killing intent? Hephaestus should be happy that he restrained it. Chapter 608. Hey, hey, hey. Wait up. Lionel looked back with a partially confused look, only to find a lanky and pale man following after him. This was other than Radlease. As for why he had quit chasing after Balthorn for the sake of catching up to Lionel, maybe only he knew the answer to that. Yes? Aya, no need to be so glum. I know your girlfriend just got snatched, but there are plenty of women in the sea. Lionel's lip curled. She didn't get snatched. Radlease caught up, slowing down to walk beside Lionel. They say denial is the first form of acceptance. Just don't stay bogged down in it for too long. It's alright, with your looks and my humor, we have the chance to be the lady killers of the freshman class. Just look at that sexy lady over there. Radlease hooked his chin over his shoulder, sending lewd looks toward Balthorn. She's already infatuated with you, just forget about that girl. Lionel shook his head. How was he even supposed to respond to this exactly? Inkith, Irelana and Balthorn lagged behind. Since they couldn't join any factions, they had no choice but to wait a few days until the exams were opened up. Only then would they be able to pick a Pika join. The atmosphere around them was clearly much less enthusiastic than Radlease. In fact, they were quite downcast. Who would feel great after being looked down upon in that fashion? They had all come here with great aspirations, only to feel as though it had been dashed. By now, it was clear to them that they'd just be playing background for Aina in the future. Such a reality left them feeling down. The one with especially complex feelings about this was Balthorn, especially after the words she had spoken about Aina. Who cared what Aina looked like if she had strength? In fact, in this world, all beauty got you was constant harassment and the right to be used as a pawn by your family. Not only did Aina had strength, but she was also never have to worry about such a thing. It felt like Balthorn was still scorning Aina for her scars at the moment, but the truth was that she was jealous. Jealous she didn't have such strength, jealous that she didn't have such freedom. Ah, it seems you still don't get it. You're a little slow, so let this more intelligent brother of yours explain. Radlease wrapped an arm around Lionel's shoulders, standing to the tip of his toes. Lionel raised another eyebrow. Im slow? Radlease coughed lightly. How do I put this delicately? Well, anyone who thinks Tier 7 treasures can drop like pies from the skies is definitely a little bit slow. Anyway. The truth was that everyone assumed that Lionel must have made a massive mistake. Maybe his world had a different ranking system for weapons. This wasn't rare in primitive worlds who had only just evolved. So, it was possible that Tier 7 in Lionel's mind was maybe a Tier 3 or 4 weapon. In fact, in some cases, there were worlds so misinformed that they gave third-dimensional weapons the ranking system for fourth-dimensional black-grade weapons. Radleys believed that Lionel was likely from a latter world, or else it was impossible that he would say such a thing about a Tier 7 treasure. That was the only possible justification. Anyone who could treat real Tier 7 black treasures in such a way wouldn't even bother to come to a place like this. They'd be from a sixth-dimensional world, or at the very least, a world close to it. Radleys continued on quickly as though not wanting Lionel to respond. He definitely had an odd way of trying to spare feelings. Listen man, you can't trust women too much. They're vindictive little demonesses. Your girlfriend likes you now, but when she sees all those tall, handsome men from Hero Peak, all of which will be stronger than you, by the way. Well, it's in their nature to be swayed. Lionel was speechless. Why did he feel like he was talking to James again? Lionel sighed when he thought of that name for the first time in a long while. He hadn't really spent a lot of time at Royal Blue Fort during the war, so he had only had an idea of who was on the battlefield. Thanks to that, he knew that his teammates were fine. But, James hadn't been on the battlefield, so he had no idea where he was. Though Lionel had promised his coach to James another chance. Truthfully, he didn't know if he wanted to. I know what you're thinking. Your girlfriend isn't exactly. Let me not speak on another man's affections. But, you should know that there are no shortage of powerful and handsome men from Hero Peak who also happen to be very rich. They can probably afford certain treatments that you cannot. Hearing Radley's endless rambling, Lionel was at a complete loss. Not speak on another man's affections? What exactly had he been doing, then, for the last 10 minutes? He had talked so much that they managed to reach the top of the mountain, only to cross a curtain of force and be greeted by an entirely new world. Lionel took it all in with a single glance. If he was in the mood, he might have been quite impressed by what he was seeing. But at the moment, it could be said that if it wasn't for his usually easygoing personality, he would have kicked even Radley's far away by now. Listen man, it'll all be fine. There are plenty of fish in the sea, Lionel tuned Radley's out. Was he worried about Aina? Not even a little bit. He didn't have to put up a false sense of bravado about it either. All he knew was that if it took even him 5 years and the world almost ending in order to get her to open up to him, well, he could only say good luck to those who deemed to try. That said, after their attempts failed, he wouldn't mind teaching them their place. Not long after the group crossed into Valiant Heart Mountain and took in the city around them, they were met by another group who seemed to have been waiting especially for them. That should be him. The one with the long goldish bronze hair. As soon as one of them confirmed, the group of 5 all converged at once. Their target? Lionel, without a doubt, you're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.